Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
So today I'm really pleased to have on Travis from Postliberal Book Reviews, a Substack where you review a wide range of books with the overall goal of, at least if I'm understanding this correctly, of looking at liberalism as it currently exists and then what might come after. Because every regime, every idea, every ideology has a shelf life. Nothing's going to last forever. And so using non-fiction and fiction to try to look into the future is a really interesting project and one I'd like to talk to you about. Additionally, you're a very close reader of both non-fiction and increasingly, with your more recent reviews, fiction. So I'm really pleased to be able to chat to you about that. So could you tell me a bit about this project, what you're doing here, looking at liberalism, what it is, the effects of it, and what might come after, using book reviews? Like, how did you start with this?
That's a good question. I think it's because I'm looking at my phone because there is I have a kind of, I think, a reasonable description of the project, like on my Substack. Hang on one second. In the About section. Okay, yeah, so I've got that up. So I'm sorry, the question is, why am I using a post-liberal quote-unquote lens when, so that's a reasonable question. It's just, I'm just adopting what I think is kind of something that's already been done by literary critics. They adopt a psychoanalytic lens, they adopt a Marxist lens, a feminist lens. And I've read, it's just a useful tool to approach text with a perspective. And then the question is, which perspective appeals to you? If you would have talked to me when I was, 19 or 20 years old, I may have had like an Ayn Rand lens or a libertarian lens or and a few years later, my views evolved, and I was that kind of third way, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, kind of liberal. I was, that is kind of liberal, centrist liberalism, or mildly left liberalism, Angela Merkel. And, I've just as I've gotten older and as my views have evolved, I've kind of evolved this, roughly post-Vatican II, kind of Catholic, but moderate, the post-Vatican II qualification of Catholicism kind of indicates I'm not, although I appreciate, the traditional aesthetics of, the Latin Mass and some of the, I love the whole history of the church really, but the philosophical orientation of a kind of contemporary, I don't think it's appropriate to call it liberal, although Vatican II is associated with a kind of liberal perspective within Catholicism, but I call it a pragmatic contemporary Catholicism. I think that coming to text with that perspective it's just who I am. So it's just what I have to do, really.
So for listeners, and just to make things clearer, I reckon it'd be good just at the outset to define what we mean by liberalism. And maybe actually if you could go into like your, particularly the post-Vatican II Catholicism, will probably make things clearer for people who don't know so much about the development of the church.
Sure. So liberalism, actually, I think you did a really good job in a recent podcast of defining liberalism. So would you feel okay if I can defer to your?
I mean, I can say what I think
definition
of when I think of liberalism, and you can agree or disagree with parts of it.
Sure. Yeah.
But to my mind, when I say liberalism, particularly because of our American audience, I don't mean someone who votes for the Democratic Party. I mean, it's an intellectual and ideological tradition from people like John Locke, John Stuart Mill to today that has seen an evolution which has as core components this centering of the individual, this this belief that an individual, their choice, their consent is important and necessary and carries some sort of moral weight when evaluating questions like governance, when looking at questions of things like autonomy. As a piece with that individualist lens, you've also got private property, individual rights, some sort of equality before the law. With respect to government, the theory of government mostly exists to actually constrain government from imposing itself excessively on individuals, so constraining the state and protecting individuals from that. There's often also a real, with respect to government, emphasis on the consent of the governed. So the fact that those who are governed say that they want something, if it's in great enough numbers, is it carries, again, some sort of moral weight, or it's some sort of moral imperative for the government to act on that. Given these tendencies, liberalism often goes together with capitalism and democracy, although I'd say those three things aren't exactly the same, and there can be some tension between, I think particularly between democracy and liberalism. There are a lot of similarities, but if you push liberalism or democracy far enough, I think one starts to exist at the expense of the other. But that's my general
100%.
view or feeling of liberalism, or what I mean when I say liberalism.
And I, have very, very little to add to that. That's, essentially exactly what I'm thinking of too. Excuse me. The only thing I do want to add is, okay, so I guess I will qualify. How does Catholicism play into this? Catholicism, the Christian Project roughly, liberalism kind of developed in opposition to Catholicism in, I think, the 17th century, roughly, in different places in Europe. But it was people who were kind of feeling, by the way, I'm not a historian, like a kind of intellectual historian, so a historian of ideas. So it is possible I'm not getting these things perfectly right. But based on the books I roughly listen to books about history and the history of ideas, and I read fiction. So while I do think that listening to books is legit, I'm often, washing the dishes or walking my dog or whatever, and I'm not, as careful as I need to be. So, and then also I'm just not a history person in general. So it's very possible I've got some of these ideas slightly fuzzy. But anyway, my understanding is liberalism kind of develops in opposition to Catholicism. It says, hey, wait a minute, we want to kind of pursue ideas, we want to pursue lifestyles that may be out of compliance with the church. And how dare you need to literally put some of these words like imprimatur would have been a stamp, I believe, on books approved by the church for publication. How dare you say that? We invent the printing press, and guess what? We're going to print all these pamphlets and things in France and Germany and wherever, and we're going to say whatever we want. And I think there's something really appealing about that sense of liberation, that sense of kind of like, there's a limitlessness, there's this possibility associated with freedom of ideas and freedom of expression, and consent of the governed, I think, is legit, and democracy, I think, is like relatively legit. But I do think, intelligent people can start to wonder, like, do we really, I mean, democracy, really? Especially in different time periods where education was like a lot less universal. So as much I'm totally fine, I think democracy is relatively legit now. I think the really exciting element of liberalism, which is different than democracy, as you say, is that freedom of idea. You know what I'm saying? Freedom of conscience. The church, I also am not a church historian, but so roughly my understanding of the church in history is, it's powerful culturally, politically, probably not as powerful as some of us think today. and often having to be very pragmatic in its relationship with monarchies in Europe. I mean, a good example of this would be, the church kind of outlawed slavery, especially slavery of, what they called, basically blacks in certain islands in like the 6th century. And yet, in Spanish New World kind of conquistadors were freely engaging in this practice, and the question is why. My understanding of why is that as the Protestant Reformation was happening and monarchies in Europe were kind of moving away from the church's sphere of influence, the Pope had to be pragmatic about its relationship with those who remained in the fold. And Spanish, the Spanish kind of Catholic monarchy was able to get concessions out of the church, out of the Pope, and whoever it was at the time. And one of them was, I mean, they got extreme to the, like, we can censor papal bulls. We can, basically we can just choose not to publish, whatever the Vatican is kind of saying, which means that, during this period of exploration of the New World, when the church actually was saying, "Hey, wait a minute, you can't go out there and just capture these people," and these kind of, I think the term at the time was like simple, but I don't think that's necessarily a term of kind of denigration. It was probably describing basically a real situation, which these people are. Some of these people just have less understanding of the world at this point in history, and that does not mean you go and take advantage of them. But Spain, basically, the bishops in Spain were chosen by the monarch, and when the Vatican was issuing these statements, they just didn't publish them. So anyway, that's an example of the church not really being quite as powerful as we think they were. Anyway, I'm getting kind of lost in in history, but I can connect this to Vatican II with a bit more facility. I promise.
No, go on as long
now?
as you like.
Yeah, sure.
We've never had an episode where we look at church history, so like go off.
No, sure, yeah. Well, I'm not. I wish I was the guy to do it, but so anyway, Vatican II. So basically. Vatican II is very, is like allegedly controversial. I guess it's somewhat controversial within the church, but I based on my research, I kind of don't understand 100% why. It's a reaction to the Vatican is Vatican II is I don't even know what the word is, a conclave, a meeting, I don't know, a kind of congress that meets over the course of several years. I think in the early 60s, maybe in late 50s, early 60s, I could have those years slightly wrong. But my understanding from reading this or listening to this wonderful book by George Weigel called To Sanctify the World is that World War II happens, communism happens, the Holocaust happens, all of these horrible things with, millions of innocent people dead. And the church is kind of sitting there like, we are allegedly the stewards of this kind of immortal tradition on earth. And we're just standing here roughly while the world is tearing itself apart. And especially in Europe, which is where we kind of have even a unique relationship. And we are just like not even a part of like what people believe anymore, what people think anymore. And they are literally killing themselves and committing genocides. And so we're doing something wrong. We're just irrelevant. We're regarded with suspicion. We're regarded as like these, this kind of backwards facing, like, elitists. And so there's basically there's a series of meetings in which, they get a bunch of, the most important people from certainly the church, but also you have observers from, Lutherans and, I'm sure Jews and rabbis, and other Protestants and other faith traditions come together and trying to figure out, like, how do we approach human beings as they are right now, many of whom, by the way, have experienced enormous loss through the Holocaust or through whatever's going on in the Soviet Union, and through possibly, United States dropping, incinerating cities in Japan. How do we, basically deal with these people who are victims right now, and then also people who are implicated in this? There are people in the Soviet Union right now. There are people in Germany right now who may believe they're like beyond the purview of redemption because of what they've been involved with right now. And so, and then the other thing is like working people and kind of poor people who are really here to like, we're supposed to be engaged with them. How do we engage all of these people as they are right now in like 1945 or whatever? And they decided like part of this is we got to throw all this stuff where like the priest in the mass used to kind of face the altar, not the crowd. He was delivering it in Latin. It's the Latin service can be truly beautiful. And you're talking music from, Bach, and it's like a truly what's called a high mass. It's like almost like how you're supposed to listen to classical music. And I am lucky that I have a couple churches around me where they have these full-blown services, the so-called smells and bells. And it is, I just really do recommend, even if you are, an avowed atheist or even anti-Catholic, and just to go sit there, not even to participate in the service, but just to observe this. If you have, especially if you're like in New York City or a big city with big old churches, somewhere in Europe, too. I really do recommend you just go and sit there. But anyway, Vatican II, the conclusion is we need to turn around. We need to have the priest kind of facing the audience. This is a kind of democratic gesture where we're embracing kind of the people. We need to be speaking in, dialect, as it were, which is relative to Latin, like would be English or French or Spanish or what, your kind of native languages. And we just need to, like, this posture of legalism and kind of, as if you have to be this ultra educated, kind of philosophically oriented person to even begin to engage with the faith. That is elitist, and that's a problem. We need to democratize. We need to make this accessible. Part of that, the church's former postures, again, as far as I understand, is more like huge textbooks and, people, doing very close readings of not just scripture, but theology and, Thomas Aquinas and things like this. While there still is a major, vein of this within Catholicism, we want to basically approach the common person with a lot more humility and with a lot more just like love. And part of that is focusing on the human element of Christianity, which of course is the person of Christ. And so Vatican II, it was a major break from the past in the posture of the church towards the people of the earth. And I think that, it's an appropriate, I think it's like, wow, I'm impressed that they actually did this. I think this is a smart move. And even though someone like me is totally fine and even attracted to that kind of former posture, and I would fit, I personally fit in there, it's not about me. It's not about guys like me. It's about millions of people whose levels of education are not, not anywhere near mine. How do we engage them? Because this message is not only reasonable. It's like, if you're me, it's a factually accurate description of human nature that certainly does have supernatural elements within it, but you almost don't even need I don't know if I'm like being blasphemous here, but like you can come to Catholic conclusions as I have, or as I did, without even engaging in the kind of supernatural elements. And so how do we deliver this kind of like philosophical product, this worldview, because it is freeing and it is like unlocking. How do you deliver this to people? And anyway, I'm sorry I'm babbling, but that's my understanding of the point of Vatican II.
No, I think that's really good. Thanks for that. Because especially like having put together what you mean by a post-Vatican II Catholicism and liberalism, I think now like, hopefully listeners have a pretty good idea of your project, or of the jumping off point of, so you see liberalism and you're reviewing books, and both presumably because of the books you're choosing to review, and within the reviews themselves, you're looking to where the, say, the intellectual, the ideological, the spiritual landscape at some point in the future might be, which I think is a really cool project. So with these reviews, actually, what makes you decide to review a certain book? Is it that it interests you or you dislike it in some way? Because there have been some books you've talked about that you don't like. Is it that you feel like it's a good jumping off point to look towards a post-liberal future? What is it?
So as I engage with, the political landscape in the United States, I have come to, read these guys like, I don't know if you've ever heard of Patrick Deneen or Adrian Vermeule, or these guys are, I think Vermeule is so-called integralist, whereas more of a integration of Catholicism and the state, which certainly scares some people. And Deneen runs the so-called, like, the group of post-liberals, which, there's a number of other people associated with that, so of Amari, others. And I don't know, I was born, I went to Catholic school as a kid and everything, but I became like an atheist very young, probably 14 or 15, and this is totally irrelevant to me, even like, kind of offended by the idea of religion in this kind of, this is a fairy tale, like, why on earth are we considering this? And I'm now, almost 40, and, the process of returning to, and it's hard to even say returning. I was like, I got the sacraments, but unless I was like a very little kid, I didn't almost ever take the stuff that seriously. And so I don't know, over the course of my 30s, it's been part of it was going to a service. Part of it was actually, I was in the military. And I was an enlisted soldier, which means I wasn't an officer, even though I graduated college. Like, I went in as an enlisted soldier when I was like 25. And I saw that I went in as a kind of Ayn Rand atheist, not as, maybe not as obnoxious as that sounds. I was kind of that's when I was actually more of a centrist liberal, like that kind of Clinton Blairite thing, but I'd been coming from a kind of libertarian background, but I was kind of pragmatizing. I was coming more to the center, and I had like a corporate job, and I was more of like a mainstream guy. And I noticed very quickly in basic training, just to be perfectly frank, I didn't have that much experience with working class, like truly, these people out of Bruce Springsteen songs where they, like jumped on a motorcycle and just like rode away from their lives kind of people, and they're 18, 19, they have a pregnant girlfriend and, all that. I just didn't have that much experience with these guys. And I did a basic training, you're thrown in, as 4 months, and I'm living with these guys, and they're great. They're wonderful. I never had a problem kind of like in, talking or hanging out with people that were different from me, but just their like what their moral values were, like what they did for fun, all of that was kind of alien to me. And I immediately recognized that the religious thing, whether it was Mormon or, a lot of them are evangelical Christians, and, this kind of more superstitious faith, at least at the time, is what I thought. It was like a software upgrade. Like you just notice immediately, like they worked harder, they didn't lie, like they weren't out cheating on their wives constantly. And the guys who maybe come from evangelical background, but didn't practice at all, covered in tattoos, just making dumb decisions with, drinking and driving, dating strippers, like just the whole thing. And you'd see, like, it was immediately apparent to me that, like, wait a minute, there's a clear advantage in terms of populations of like who's going to succeed over the long term. And that was probably the first time where intellectually I realized, like, wait a minute, I thought this was like a hindrance when it's clearly not. So anyway, I was probably 25, but I still didn't, I didn't practice. So there's a longer term evolution, which I guess you're asking me about, how, why do I choose these books? And I guess I'm getting away from the subject, but yeah. So I guess I should just switch to directly addressing the question because I don't remember why I was going.
Feel free to meander. We've got time.
But so, okay. So why do I choose these books? I also am, so I've got a kind of religious perspective, which again, I think is somewhat moderate in the global scheme of things. And I've got a political perspective, which I also think is relatively moderate. Like in the New York Times recently had a kind of thing where you could answer questions and put your little dot on this kind of XY axis. And I was like almost literally in the direct center, and there wasn't even really a party for that. And, I've been a Democrat in my life. I've been a Republican in my life. And I totally am open to both political perspective or the whole multiplicity of political perspectives. That said, the world of fiction, is not. And, so I think I hate to sound like I'm just a moderate, but everyone else went left, but it really does appear that even if you're kind of uncompromising, and not willing to go into some really, in my opinion, kind of inappropriate identitarian directions within contemporary context, like the world of fiction is not really a fertile, it's not like a fruitful place to engage. And maybe, and by the way, I also can understand, maybe that's also good. It may be reasonable for fiction to be kind of processing some of these anxieties we have around, feminism and LGBT and race and things. And, I don't want to rail against that, because I think that these historical processes are probably doing important work. That said, it's just work that I'm not a part of, and it's not really reactive to my interests or concerns. And so I've got to look to where my thing is happening. And then crazily, there's this enormous, kind of flowering of things that are interesting to me within these self-published and more marginal space, kind of internet space, which, again, I probably have I'm probably a moderate right, character compared to contemporary views, but I'm totally open to say Ross Barkin's perspective. I'm totally open to almost really anyone, as I've said, in a note somewhat recently, that I really like being challenged, and I like challenging myself by reading kind of ideologically competing personalities, or ideological competitors, I should call them. And so anyway, I'm just focusing on this little sphere of fiction that's also feeling marginalized by the process that's happening within literary fiction right now. And I think, I'm happy to kind of just hang out in this smaller group with these guys.
Because one thing I've noticed with the books that you've chosen to review over time is initially the books you were choosing were much more obviously political, or much more explicitly political. So The Origins of Woke by Richard Hanania. The Challenge of Policing Minorities in a Liberal Society by Joseph Heath. You did have some fiction. There's All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy there.
Yeah.
But it's much more solidly non-fiction. Whereas recently, your last few reviews have all been novels. You've got The Neighbour by Caleb Caudell, In Providence, David Herod, The Novelist by Jordan Castro. Yeah. You did an interesting review of my first book by Honor Levy, or my first novel, I forget.
My first book,
My first book, Incel by ARX-Han. What has it been over time that's made you start leaning towards fiction? Is there something about fiction that you feel reveals the currents of our time more effectively than non-fiction? Is there something in fiction that lets you see over the horizon in more interesting ways, or in different ways? What has it been? Or has it just been an unconscious process? You've just been reviewing novels because you found them more interesting recently?
No, it's actually a very sad story. I guess it starts. I've actually had like other kind of anonymous fiction reviewing blogs. I've long been interested in exactly the sphere of, this kind of like, roughly kind of, right wing self published fiction. I've been interested. I've had in the past, I reviewed some other books under a different name, and I was surprised by how reactive the authors were, and you could talk right to them, and you get, people are interested, and I was like, wow, that's awesome.
It is really
and
cool.
Then I stopped doing it. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah. But I'd like just other stuff on my plate. And I don't know, I kind of just like let it lapse for a little bit. And then this past year, it's actually quite sad. Like my best friend ever died, which is very, I grew up with him.
I'm sorry to hear that.
He's been my friend since I was 2 years old. Yeah. And we went to high school together, enjoyed the military together, really did everything. And he had this really tragic, like they don't know, but kind of progressive. He had MS, but he had an alternate, something else is going on. We don't know. And it's just horrible. But so I was like basically depressed in a way where, I'm very kind of active in the gym. And that was a big thing where I would just go into the gym and I just like couldn't, I wasn't having super dark thoughts and I wasn't kind of brooding all the time, but I just didn't have energy. I couldn't work out really. I couldn't, I myself been writing a novel for like 9 years and I just couldn't write. And I was like, I couldn't even really read that much, but I could go about my job. I was, it was a sad thing that happened, but I was mostly healthy and fine. I was sleeping okay. I was eating okay, but I just couldn't like do extra stuff. And I said, as a New Year's resolution, I'm going to try to, get back to reviewing books. And so I started with just like, I was listening to nonfiction books as I continue to do. And I would just like write up a little review and put it on a Substack. And I wasn't really trying to engage with a big community, really. I was just like keeping a diary of the books which I have done before. Like there was a year where I had a moleskin little notebook that I wrote down every book in like a paragraph review just to remember, what the book was about. And so I started just doing that again in order to practice kind of getting out of, just feeling like I couldn't do anything. Like I didn't have the extra, beyond my job and, childcare stuff. Like I couldn't do anything. And so anyway, that started to resolve, as it does, time, I still am, sad about it, about his death, but it was a project for me to kind of like get back into reading and writing again. And so then when I felt like a bit more, capable, like things were, I was able to do this again. I returned to the books that I was always I always want to engage with, because ultimately, I'd like to release my own book within the same sphere. And I want to know, the other people in it, and I want to have relationships with them, and I want to know the people who are reading these books. And so that's ultimately, why I focus on fiction, because I like fiction. There's a time in my life I didn't read any nonfiction. And now I really only read nonfiction in order to help me understand and contextualize fiction better. So fiction has always kind of been the thing for me. But in the beginning of this year, when I was just starting this thing, it was, because I wasn't really reading. I was listening to books and I listened to nonfiction. And I wrote kind of little half-assed reviews.
That actually, it makes sense in that your reviews of nonfiction books, your earlier ones, in part it might have been because you were starting out. They're shorter, less detailed. As you've gone on, your reviews are getting longer and longer and longer, more detailed, more jumping off to, I wouldn't say unrelated things, but using the text to talk about broader issues. In short, I think they're getting more interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Especially your most recent ones have been really great. But I think your talent really is in looking at novels or short stories, or let's say a novella in the case of In Providence, and really deeply analyzing the book from a technical perspective in terms of things like prose, plotting, characterization, but also using it to look at other trends, which I've really enjoyed. That's when I feel like you've been at your
Oh,
best.
really?
Your recent reviews of novels.
Thank you.
So when you're picking up a book or when you're reading a book, how do you approach it? Particularly one that you're going to review. Is there a checklist in your mind of, say, okay, what's the prose like, what's the pacing like, and so on? Or do you say do what I do, where I tend to just read through a book and almost try to agree with it as much as I can. I try to immerse myself in it as much as possible, really live in its world, live in its ideas. This goes for fiction and non-fiction. And then I'll approach it more critically, normally a few days after I've finished it.
Um,
What's your approach to reading? Because you're a very close reader.
So, there's this woman named Louise Rosenblatt who's really famous in what is it called? The kind of teaching of English. And she has this theory, it's called like transactional theory, I think. And that's that basically every time you read, there is a transaction between the reader and the text. And there's a difference between what are called efferent transactions and aesthetic transactions. And an efferent transaction is...
I was wanting to ask you exactly about this. Yep.
The efferent transaction is like informational reading. So you come to a text with a need. You need to understand how to operate your microwave, or you need to understand how to do surgery, or whatever you're doing. And so you are looking for information. The aesthetic transaction is the kind of, the poem where you come to it. I actually I'm not as clear on how the aesthetic transaction happens, but the bottom line is you bring your world, your kind of mental model and your world to the reading of the text. And then there's, this transaction happens, and there's a difference between informational and aesthetic. I am almost always in that aesthetic mode. I don't know how to exactly classify this. It's probably like your IQ, but like my rough ability to do information is like pretty good. I've always thought I'm always like a 95th percentile guy, like able to pretty much understand like science or business or technology or, these kind of things, but I'm not the best either. But my aesthetic, it's probably not your IQ, but like my ability and comfort level with aesthetics is just a lot high. It's always been kind of, a lot higher than my informational. And so I'm going to almost every book, even sometimes I'm even doing aesthetic transactions, which I'm sure a lot of people do too, but with informational texts. Like I'm sometimes listening to tone or whatever. I'm sure almost everyone's doing this too, but I sometimes wonder if I'm, would have been better, in a more technical career path had I been more oriented towards just like straight up informational text. Maybe you are, or maybe, like ARX-Han is a good example of a guy whose prose does a good job of including a lot of like information. You know what I mean? Or of big authors like Michael Crichton, if you've ever read him. He was a doctor, and like if you read Jurassic Park, he's just able to like incorporate that kind of efferent thing into the novel. But anyway, I'm going to books with an aesthetic transaction happening, but also an openness to like whatever, I'm kind of just down to, like, you agree. But I just make a lot of annotations. I'm often, as I think I've told you before, I'm reading on an iPad normally because I look up words a lot. Like I need, like, what does this word mean? And then I'm using the Apple Pencil to log, like, oh, I want to highlight this section. I really like this, or I don't like this, or, this sounds nice, or this is a crazy idea. And then when I go back to do my review, I kind of like read through all my annotations. And from there I'm working on what's called Google Documents. And I start to kind of group, I try and like start to figure out like, what are my overall impressions? I need like 4 or 5 headings. And I start to organize my annotations under these headings. And then from there, I start to pull quotes like, okay, so page 72, I had this thing about the beautiful prose, whatever, like we'll put that under prose style. And under this, we had, let's say the recent Caleb Caudell one, where there's a lot on diet. There was a lot on media and drugs. And I just had these different headings. And then the review just starts to kind of shape up around the annotations. And the good thing about using the digital reader is you can, search. You can do like search your annotations. You can search keywords. And so I spent a lot of time engaging with like the search function and then pulling quotes based on my initial read through.
So the efferent and aesthetic distinction is really interesting. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I was wanting to talk about that. Because it seems to me that maybe this is just getting hung up on nomenclature, but say aesthetic reading carries with it a lot of information as well. It's almost the distinction is focusing on semantics, so that more informational reading or efferent reading is a focus on, okay, what's the semantic informational content, the definitions of these words that you're reading over. And the aesthetic reading, I think it carries a great deal of information as well, but the information is not necessarily semantic. The information might be contained in how beautiful the words sound together, or the sort of images that they evoke in a reader, it's a very real form of information, but it's quite different. It's not necessarily declarative information you're receiving or definitional information. It's something that's much, much harder to pin down. But anyone who's read a particularly beautiful book, for example, has definitely experienced it.
I agree.
It's
I think with the aesthetic things, a lot of it is connotation. So like there's just certain like words that have, like, if you're describing flakes of snow, that word flake, which appears a lot, I forget the name of the poet that Harold Bloom was into, but he was like a gay American poet who's, kind of romantic in the early 1900s that people like. This word flake is, or you hear it in Joyce, the flakes of snow falling. There's that image. I don't know why there's like a kind of positive charge to it, but there kind of is. At least in my view. And I think also like things with like foods and smells, and when you hear like certain like flowers, like if there's like the smell of lavender, I can't even really remember the smell of lavender, but just the positive connotation, like kind of in my memory of this, is, I think, part of the aesthetic transaction. And so while there's probably a cultural element to, like, for instance, if I recall correctly from my days in teaching in Asia, snakes have a different, kind of cultural, imaginative connotation in Asia, roughly, than they do in the West, where we think of snakes from a biblical sense of kind of negative and bad. I think there's a more positive halo, kind of impression around the snake, the image of the snake in Asia. Whether or not that's true, there probably is an example of cultural dependency, related to aesthetic values.
Yeah, with the aesthetic thing, it's I think of it in some ways as, say, in painting. If you think of impressionism or pointillism or something like that, where they're getting away from representing something in. They wouldn't have thought of it at the time as photorealistic, but say a photorealistic or a very, very realistic depiction of something. It's more an appeal to inner sense. So when you're talking about lavender, the smell of lavender, how you can't even necessarily bring to mind that sensation of smelling lavender in a moment, but the sort of that symbol, or the description of smelling lavender refers to an inner experience that you can recall. You can recall the sensations interiorly of smelling lavender, if not the precise smell. And I feel in many ways that's what something like Impressionism is doing.
It could be.
How it offers enough of an intimation to refer to this inner experience of whatever's depicted, not to brute senses, but to what it feels like to experience those things. And I think in many ways that aesthetic reading is doing something quite similar. Say with similes, if you describe someone, as stubborn as an ox, I mean, kind of everyone knows that you're not referring to them literally as an ox.
Yeah.
But there's this inner sense, this experience of having experienced an ox's stubbornness, or at least heard of it, that it's referring to. So it's this weird sort of informational exchange where what is being exchanged is almost something that points to the echoes of your own experience of something. It's a very strange way of...
But, this is kind of a Catholic idea.
Communicating in many ways.
The question is, how individual is the experience of an ox? I'm sure there are people who, what I mean? I'm sure there are people who worship, something like, approximating an ox. And there may be ways of seeing an ox as almost like a divine, or, at least certainly raised up in status. But to some extent, the experience of the ox from the perspective of a civilized person is it smells, it grunts, it is it's got these kind of weird hair on it. It's kind of relative to a human, not, it doesn't have the best, it has a lot of muscle, and it's maybe stays on task, and there's maybe a nobility in its embrace of maybe labor. But I've never had to work with an ox, but I don't know if they require whipping or anything like that. But, in general, I think there's a lot of commonalities, in the experience of people who read literature, and then, how you relate to an ox.
And that's the fascinating thing about the project of literature, or art in general, because there's this continuous balancing act of how individual a piece of art is to be. Because I guess at its maximal extent, if you made a maximally individual piece of art, it would presumably be just unintelligible to anyone but the person who made it. And then if you make something, if you just, sort of in some arbitrary sense, make it minimally individual, it'll be boring.
Yeah.
It'll just be almost white noise. So there's this constant balancing going on between a person making a piece of art, trying to make it a reflection of their experience in some way, but also making it sufficiently general that other people can understand it.
Well, I have a question for you related to this.
Fascinating project.
I kind of wonder, in terms of social media, in terms of, markets in general, and especially what, we're doing, which is trying to get readers to pay attention and relate to us. I noticed that, frankly, there's a clear path to success, quote unquote, algorithmic success is probably how we term it. And, that path, there's probably a number of paths, but one of them is reducing specificity. Certainly on Substack, it's talking about, it's hot takes on politics. Roughly, you're either the pro or anti-Trump camp. And I've noticed, especially if you go into wider, I don't spend way too much time on Substack, but you will run into these accounts with 1 million followers, and it's it's always some resistance liberal, kind of talking about Trump did this or that, and it just seems a huge market for this kind of commentary. And then I read it, and it's not. It is speaking to universals. It is speaking to fears and things like this. But I don't find a lot of substance. Let's say, and certainly, I'm sure the true is. I'm sure the reverse is true. I certainly, especially being slightly more on the right, I get this stuff, and again on the as we were talking before the show about avoiding current events, I have no problem really doing that because I don't find a lot of substance in the analysis. and from my quote unquote side or not. But that's the stuff that sells, or that's the stuff that travels, as it were. And so I just wonder, you're more successful than me here, and I just wonder how this, how you kind of strategize around this reality that, like, to bring more people in, you kind of have to do dumber things.
In terms of that, there's not really a strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So Levi and I do this, like, for the most part because we like it.
Yeah, right.
We both acknowledge that what we do is not, like, we're not going to be the next Joe Rogan by talking about weird books. There needs, in order for me, at least, I won't speak for Levi, to be willing to continue doing this, I need to be sufficiently interested in it. And given that my interests are just more niche, this is always going to be much more niche.
Yeah.
We do need to try to do something to get better discoverability. That probably involves more technical stuff like SEO, and short form content, not just 2.5-hour episodes about Julius Evola. It's interesting, actually, what you were saying before about what seems to do the best, at least on Substack. But I think this does apply to articles distributed over the internet and also in physical media more generally, in that it really sounds like those sort of articles stirring up people based on political affiliations, or, for example, very popular ones at the moment seem to be men complaining about women, or women complaining about men. In general, never about a specific man or woman. So presumably, the entity you would be having a relationship with, but men and women in the abstract.
Although you wonder if that's what's in the back of these people's minds too. Like, my wife or husband did something obnoxious today. Now let me extrapolate that to all men or women.
Yeah. But those things actually seem to be, if we're looking at it through the efferent versus aesthetic lens, they seem to be strongly aesthetic and minimally efferent, in that you were saying there's not much analysis, or the analysis is very shallow, which is in some ways probably the point. If you can make something that is strongly emotionally charged in some pleasurable way, and I do think there is a perverse pleasure that most, if not all, people feel in reading something that makes you angry or scared in some way. There's a sweet spot of emotional activation. But there's strongly aesthetic works and minimally efferent works. And that seems to go down really well.
Yeah, right. I mean, you're right. I don't know. So I guess on the subject, I actually don't, I kind of like you, I don't ever really think I'm going to have like a big, a huge platform. That said, my theory is I've got like a thesis, which I actually kind of want to read, because the thesis, I don't think, I don't have a big home among, because I think post-liberals are more like traditional, let's call it, than me. And then a lot of people in the fiction world are a bit more like, I don't know, pragmatic, let's say, than I am. But so, my thesis has been, which is a kind of meta thing here, but my thesis is to have my thesis, which I think is strong, and then just kind of sell it, and ideally, persuade some people, or at least persuade people to like thinking like, oh, this is a person that I think is reasonable to have in the feed, even if I don't necessarily buy the whole thing. But I think I don't know if you read in my last article, in my last review of Caleb Caudell, kind of talking about the assumptions that liberalism makes on autonomy and education. And if we are going to talk about like what does a post-liberal program look like, I think this is actually a good transition point here. But I think I am making the
it's good. Good time to go.
So I think I am making. I think the problem. I think one of the big problems with liberalism is that, Voltaire and Jefferson, these kind of figures from the past, we're writing about a different period, and they were engaged with, there was a lot of development. There's a lot, especially in Paris, there was these salons, there was these people, Voltaire is like an Obama level celebrity. Like when I don't know if it was his funeral or what, but I mean, you're talking like the nation stops and goes into the streets like JFK just got assassinated. He was an intellectual mega star, and he just, everyone wanted a piece of him, and Rousseau was kind of around in this period. He was kind of a smaller fish and having to jump around from country to country, because I think he'd written things against the church, but I think he was like in Switzerland or something is where he was able to stay, or, I don't fully remember, but there was a lot of hope that, like, here we've got, examples of kind of wealthy people engaging in these conversations about politics and religion, and things are just changing. And it's almost like a 1960s style, like the future is so bright. And all we have to do is extrapolate. When we have Voltaires in the peasantry, imagine that future. Imagine a future of just like individual autonomy, where everyone is educated, everyone is able to kind of pick and choose, and maybe you will have educated Catholics, maybe you will have educated, kind of monarchists, but ultimately the system is going to, facilitate this just powerful sense of individual autonomy, from tradition and from nature. And, it's just, that's what the future is going to look like. And, I think we're now, several hundred years into this experiment, basically in France, but the United States especially. And I don't want to sound like I'm, some dark bad guy, but I just don't think I don't think that's going to be a realizable thing. Like, I'm an English teacher, and so I do certainly believe in, like, the ideal of universal literacy. But I think we do need to manage our expectations on how deep, on how, like, basically like what our human potential is. And if it's true that there's going to be a huge number, possibly like the majority of people are not really approaching that kind of Voltairean gold standard, and are basically making decisions based on, as you've pointed out, these kind of aesthetic, these more like aesthetic inputs, let's call them, like where, frankly, a figure like Trump is motivating masses through just emotional appeals, not really the informational appeal. And not that the emotional appeal is illegitimate, but they're tied to these more like base, frankly, animal humanity more than what a Catholic would view as a kind of a higher order, more of spiritual humanity. And if the reality is that a lot of people are just kind of not going to be able to engage with this higher order stuff, or not engage with it as much as we would like, the question of how, if the system that basically expects them to be doing this, like, is this right? Is this kind of, do you set up a system that's expecting everyone to be brilliant, and it's like, kind of, no, you don't. That's kind of unreasonable. That's extremely unreasonable, in fact. And so if we've got an unreasonable, like extreme, again, in my view, extremely unreasonable expectations, we've got to start figuring out, well, what kind of system does work? I will admit that I don't want to talk about my job too much, but it does inform my perspective on some of these things. And you do learn like strategies for approaching basically students who will struggle with material more than others. And part of this is what's called differentiation, which is like creating similar assignments, where these students are still kind of accessing curriculum, is the term, but there might not be the same demands on And, there's a lot to, you can say a lot about kind of special education and how it works. That's kind of like a different topic that I don't really want to talk about too much. But I think this model is not crazy for it kind of integrating this into a post-liberal system. And the fear would be, how do you identify, basically, just put it out all on the table. If there are citizens who aren't really able to access the kind of central element of liberalism, how do we differentiate their, basically the demands in such a way that, like, and I'm talking huge numbers of people, are able to exist within a system that, are able to exist within modernity and aren't just these prey of, quote unquote, free society, which means really, capital is operating in such a way that they're taking, in my view, they're taking advantage of people who are basically less self-restrained. And so especially like in the Caudell review, talking about fast food and, drugs are still illegal, but that's like rapidly changing in the United States. And, how drugs I think are quite bad. I think they're very bad. Even marijuana I think is bad. It clouds the mind. It takes you out of your rational thinking. It makes you less motivated. It's just like, there are a lot of people who do not need this input into their lives. It's like already hard enough. We don't need to confuse them and add this input here. And then the worst part is that, I don't want to say much of the time, but sometimes, let's say, the people who precisely don't need to be clouding their judgment with these things are the ones doing it. And so this would be a good example of, like, a liberal system would say there needs to be equality. If drugs are legal, they're legal for everyone. But, and this is going to sound controversial, but I kind of have to step out and be a bit controversial here. At some point, I kind of think you need to say, like, there are some people for whom drugs should not be legal. And there are some people for maybe it's still an extremely bad idea, in my opinion. But, like, there are some people who, like, are making this work, apparently. Right. But there are a lot of people for whom, like, this should just not really even be on the table. And I don't mean this I don't want this to sound like punitive on them, because I'm actually trying to, my view is I want to work with this group of people who are basically being harmed by a liberal system that's presuming, like, a lot more autonomy than everyone's able to achieve. And I myself, and I feel somewhat confident saying this because I myself live a fairly disciplined life. Like, I'm not really taking advantage, besides the ideas thing, besides being kind of synonymous writer on Substack, which, I view as kind of a modern salon system. I myself am not really drinking a lot of alcohol. I'm not, I'm not certainly not using drugs. I'm not, I don't live a very, like, libertine life. Like, I'm a dad. I pretty much eat healthy. I work out. I go to my job. Like, my big things are, like, I go fly fishing, like, I know, like 4 times a year. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So anyway, I myself would really have no problem living. If you were to say, like, to me, I'm not allowed to buy X amount of alcohol per week. I'm not allowed to buy, drugs at all. That's, like, wonderful. I think that's appropriate. This is going to be very controversial to a certain stripe of a certain person who has a very Western concept of what freedom is, which is, like, freedom from limitation whatsoever. And I do think, actually, so the Postliberal Book Reviews little, like, blurb thing, which I can't even, like, I'm looking at it on my phone. Of course, I can't get it to show me the entire text, but it says, these are post-liberal reviews of mostly contemporary books, which is true. I'm interested in a kind of ecumenical Christian futurism. Ecumenical means kind of a marriage of all these Christian groups, and even that's, like, not 100% true, but it's roughly true that I'm interested in most Christian perspectives, even though I'm a Catholic. But I'm interested in this as a functional synthesis that is, like, putting all of these ideas together and making them work in reality of the kind of major global historical. Now, here's where I've got to like remember this off the top of my head. I think it says historical trends, and then semicolon. Colon. I believe it says Western pragmatism and Eastern traditionalism. And what that means is, I don't know if you know of Edward Said, but he has this concept of what's called Orientalism. He was a literary critic. Orientalism is probably it's a true thing. It's basically where in the 20th century, 19th century, probably 18th century, the East, as in Russia to a certain extent, but certainly like Asia and India, were regarded as backwards looking. They were regarded as superstitious. They were regarded as basically just like not kind of like barbaric, benighted. And the West, in Europe especially, this kind of predates America. Like America was a big player when this thinking was happening. The West was progressive. It was forward thinking. It was civilized, and it was not bound by superstition. It's very much this kind of Enlightenment, thing. And part of the Western program of like kind of ridding itself of superstitious Christianity and Catholicism was this drive towards being more civilized and a way to differentiate from kind of Eastern benightedness, right? And so Edward Said, Orientalism is this. It is kind of like a racist idea that people from the East are more like hidebound and bound to the past, and they're looking backwards. And here in the West, of course, in wonderful Europe, where we're moving into the future of science and of blah blah blah, right? Part of the thesis of my blog is like I think there's like even in that, I'm not sure that framing is perfect, but even if we accept that framing of the West as progressive, as the East as hidebound or as traditional, let's say, I think there's like synthesizing these impulses is worth doing, and there is some conservatives view the West as kind of problematic in that it's just like brainlessly, trying to move, just like go into the future without like any, it's like, is it advised to do so? Like this kind of Brave New World sense. Like, are you sure this is the right move, or what are you using where's your rudder? How are you making these decisions? What's your moral guide? Is it just simply, do you like kind of this Elon Musk style, like we do it because we can? Or, this kind of John F. Kennedy, why do we go to the moon? Because it's there, and it's like, a traditionalist would be like, well, I mean, let's like, how about like having a better reason for doing something? But anyway, I think there's like, in this kind of interesting sense of melding these two major East and West forces into a kind of pragmatic traditionalism, which is what I view Vatican II as doing. It is, the church was kind of Western tradition, but now it's trying to become a bit more open. I think that's kind of the spirit here. It's to take the past and bring it into the future as far as we can, but within reason. So anyway, all of that is kind of preamble. To what I'd like is to share the kind of the thesis of the blog. Is that all right? I mean, unless I'm like kind of
yeah.
all right. So here it is. So I say the thesis of this blog is somewhat complex. First, on innumerable fronts, Enlightenment liberalism has been a major success. Which that would be like a controversial statement to like a number of like traditionalist Catholics. And so I'm kind of trying to orient myself like within Catholicism, but understanding that Enlightenment liberalism is actually like, it's been necessary. And we can talk about why. But anyway, second, a major part of its success is due to the moral foundation provided by Christianity, which established widespread agreement that society should not, A, create an enormous industry out of ripping the beating hearts out of enslaved captives, which, probably was true of my, something like this is probably true of my own ancestors in Ireland, pre-Christian Ireland, but really pagan people everywhere, but especially this is in reference to, the Aztecs. But then, or B, orienting its people towards superstitious worship of bears or other wild animals whose indifference to the suffering of others is even pre-pagan. So pagan peoples in Europe, like especially I think Germany, there would have been this worship of this kind of war culture and this worship of power and strength. And there's this interesting book about the history of the bear in pagan religions, and a lot of it's strength and it's raw power. But in the Catholic perspective, that worship of animals, which can seem kind of benign and kind of hippie-ish, there is something wrong with worshiping something that basically isn't human, it doesn't have concern for the welfare of others. It doesn't have reason. There's a bestial quality, literally, to the bear, and kind of putting that up as that's what you're working towards. There's something irrational about that, and therefore it is problematic within the Christian conception. It's not just a super, this is different than our God. It's that it's irrational to do so. You're trying to become a beast, right? Yes, we understand you need to fight a war, but you shouldn't be aspiring to be a beast. So anyway, instead, Christians encourage sober and rational analysis of what we call natural law, which is, I don't know, we'll talk about that later maybe. But third, the social and cultural rupture that happened between some European societies and their Christian pasts is a normal and healthy stage of social development, a kind of cultural adolescence. A child must separate from its parent, and that process can involve rebellion. That does not mean the child should or will abandon the parent. So French Revolution, this kind of secular modernity can seem to a lot of conservative Christians as the sky is falling in. Oh my God. Instead, my thesis is try to frame this as teenage rebellion, which is actually developmentally appropriate in that the teenager has to separate from the parent and the family in order to grow up and be an individual. And so this can look like fights and I hate you, I'm never talking to you again, blah, 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 blah. Yes, that can be scary as a parent. And, from the Christian perspective, this kind of secularization of Europe can seem scary, but they need to go their own way developmentally for a little bit, or maybe a long bit, who knows, in order to become themselves. And so we shouldn't be, Christians should kind of calm down a little bit because this is necessary, at least in my framing of the way this works. So fourth, the kind of Anglo-American Christian liberalism of the 20th century. This would be your kind of World War II, Anglosphere, probably including Australia. That triumphed over communism and fascism. It did so because it provided the best system for facilitating technological and material development. So that's basically my view, is that if communism or if fascism were better at marshaling resources and developing new technologies, we might be living in a very different world. It's because liberalism...
I'd agree with that.
And so it's because liberalism is basically engaged with reality in a way that its competitors aren't, that it won. And I don't want to say just the person that wins is necessarily right, but in this, I think it's worth considering liberal, again, I'm kind of arguing with conservative Christians who hate liberalism. So I think it's reasonable to say that liberalism is there's a lot going on here and you can't just throw this away. So anyway, that said, wait, where am I here? I'm sorry. Okay. So, right. But I think many secular liberals who are kind of caught up in this period of history underestimate the importance of the kind of Christian and the natural law foundation of that variety of liberalism, which is a prerequisite for innovation. So the order that was assumed in this kind of Christian, kind of Protestant liberalism of the Anglosphere, I believe, basically it is the Christian foundation that provides the base on which innovation and in the engagement with reality that we saw is possible. Because there's a kind of order, and again, not in a supernatural sense, not in a kind of woo sense, but in a practical philosophical sense. It's the Christian orientation towards the future and towards order that makes liberalism possible. In fact, that is true because it is the kind of the Christian concept of the spirit, which individuates us from race and tribe or class, that we do get liberal individualism, right? It's that, the kinds of the spiritual conception of you containing multitudes is where historically we roughly get liberal individualism at all. And it's not a surprise that this developed in Europe because that's where, Christianity was. So anyway, so 6, as many Enlightenment liberals have become attached to left or right Nietzschean moral frameworks, where we talk about what left Nietzscheanism is, it's roughly kind of the walking away. It's roughly like the kind of, let's call it transhumanist, ideas of kind of liberation from nature, liberation from the body, maybe liberation from gender, liberation from, nature, let's call it. That would be a kind of left transhumanism thing where you're just walking away from like those kind of traditional conceptions of what the natural world should be. Right Nietzscheanism is that more kind of Nazi, like where you're walking away from, it's not right to murder. It's not right to like treat people as, based on race and religion and class. It's not right to do this. That kind of Nazi thing is like the right Nietzschean framework. So there are many Enlightenment liberals who are.
It is interesting with both of those. How they both really do seem to be responses to Nietzsche's problem of the death of God.
Yeah.
Which at least in my reading of it, he seemed very distressed about it. Like it wasn't said, "Oh, this is great. God has bled to death under our knives."
Interesting.
The problem of nihilism really bothered him, and so that left and right Nietzscheanism you just described, both of those seem to be responses to the nihilism from the loss of some sort of spiritual framework.
Interesting. So I haven't read Nietzsche since I was probably 19 or 20, but I was very into him at the time. And my memory is there's something scary, but there's something like you kind of have to like the Übermensch was like the person who is willing to die in this pursuit of greatness. And there's like often that means like going into the unknown. I guess an example would be kind of blasting yourself off into space and not knowing if you're going to like come back. And you just like, that's what you kind of need to be able to do is like, you are so strong and just like, committed that like the fear of the unknown is not stopping you. We need to like launch into the future. And so whatever, like the left version of that is one thing, the right version of that is another thing, and kind of Catholics, or Christians would say like, well, there should be a bit of restraint here. You shouldn't just be pursuing these kind of godless conceptions of the future, like with reckless abandon. But anyway,
sorry, continue. Sorry for interrupting.
No, thanks.
I thought that was an interesting point you made.
And that's also not me. Rufo has talked about left Nietzscheanism. I think that Patrick Deneen talks about left and right Nietzscheanism. So it's really
and I think Bloom in the Closing of the American Mind was also talking about the Nietzscheanization of the left.
Oh, really?
I forget when that was written, but a few decades
I've never
ago.
read that. Yeah, I think that's the 70s. Okay, so but anyway,
yeah, something like that.
So as the kind of as like contemporary people like polarize into left and right Nietzschean frameworks, I think there's room for a coalition of like ecumenical Christians, by which I mean like I don't know, I don't want to like put people out, but there are some strains of Christianity which I find to be like kind of lacking in intellectual content and not super serious, but of more like sober-minded kind of Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox Christians who will kind of apply their understanding of morality and natural law to the development of technology. So the idea should be to be on the cutting edge, to be engaged with AI, to be engaged with whatever, even biomedical stuff. But, while keeping in mind that like, we do believe a human embryo is kind of something that you don't like just wash down a laboratory sink, like it, because you just don't need that for an experiment anymore, Okay. 7th, the Enlightenment and this quote unquote marketplace of ideas are merely branches of civilization, not the root. So these things have happened within a broader tree, that has many branches. But there's a lot of people, especially these kind of like Enlightenment liberals today, this kind of intellectual dark web or Richard Hanania or these people, where that is the tree. Like there's nothing outside of the Enlightenment. There's nothing outside of the marketplace of ideas. And that's, kind of crazy to me. So civilization accommodates people who view, quote unquote, liberation from nature or religion or society or God as meaningful political project. So, we tolerate these people. But that's because we need to facilitate intellectual development. Like you need to be allowed to go through phases. That's another kind of problem. I'm not Mr. Free Speech. I'm not Mr. Scared of, all these kind of censors and all that. That said, I do join with that kind of free speech crowd in thinking that like you can't just outlaw, certain, philosophical perspectives, even if they are super scary, because people need to be allowed to go through phases and then, and like, and move on and develop and mature. And so if you believe something that's kind of outside the Overton window, that doesn't necessarily mean you're always going to believe that. And it may not be bad to kind of, suppress to some extent some bad ideas, but there needs to be a mechanism for like allowing people to play with things that are dangerous and difficult without like, oh, you're out. You can never work, in this industry again. You can never do this again, whatever. Like you need to be able to go through a phase. So anyway, that's why we want to encourage this kind of multiplicity of ideas, because we need people to go through phases and develop and mature, right? Similar to that kind of adolescent developmental thing. But those who find themselves committed only to enlightenment, only to liberalism, only to modernity, right, are rooted in abnormal and revolutionary episodes within the larger span of history, right, which is largely kind of hostile to these ideas. So history itself is not just a series of revolutions. It's like, it's a lot of stasis. And then there's like revolutionary periods. And if you only are rooted in these extreme periods, then like, I just question like your understanding of like what it means to be human in general. You know what I mean? And then I guess so my final note here is, so therefore kind of like knowing that our cultures are passing through a kind of rebellious adolescence, like what we have to do now is just like weather this, and try and encourage a sense of maturation as the development happens, but also like enjoy the kind of discovery of youth and enjoy the openness of adolescence. And so anyway, that's kind of my plea to Christian conservatives, which is, roughly where I am. But like, we should also understand that like, there's a lot of wonderful things about this kind of rebellious transgression that's happening, in slow motion over the periods of hundreds of years, like in the West.
There's a huge amount.
Yeah, sorry.
that we could go into. No, don't apologize at all. That's why I have you on. One really interesting thing there is that I tend to find the most interesting people, the people who are in some way orphaned intellectually, or they just don't fit clearly in anywhere. And the project you just outlined is the sort of thing where someone who's, I'd say, a reflexive liberal, so someone whose first principles are liberal and unexamined, so the things that they believe are just right without any sort of reflection, would hear what you're saying, some sort of questioning of liberal orthodoxy, and say, this guy's a right-wing extremist. But then I can also imagine very conservative Christians hearing you talk about how this adolescent rebellion and transgressiveness has some merit, and say, yeah, this guy's a blasphemer, this guy's a heathen, or just pretending to be a Christian. I find the most interesting things are often happening when someone's getting attacked from all sides.
Which I haven't really been attacked, So I mean, like, yeah, but I don't engage. I don't have that big of a, I'm not talking to that many people really, But I don't know. It just
so
tell me.
If I understand correctly, one thing that you mentioned that you teach English that seems to be motivating some of this project is your experience with children of varying abilities. Yeah. And the recognition that it depends on what you're, I guess, optimizing for in a human life, so what you consider to be valuable in a human life. But there are certain things that most people consider fairly unobjectionable. Like, say, we want to try to stop people making decisions that will irreversibly damage their lives, or we want to stop people making decisions that just make them live in misery, or at least give them some sort of ability to avoid making those sorts of decisions. And it seems to me that you've, particularly in your latest review, at least at the time of recording, of the Neighbour by Caleb Caudell, you were saying, say, within liberalism as of 2024, you have certain people who are just in terms of their temperament, able to constrain their desires, and that it's probably a combination of how they were born and how they were raised, and some people who can't. And if your means of teaching people to restrain desires is in a secular way, just appealing almost to their rationality, just saying, okay, well, if you think about in the future, you're not going to have a very good job if you, say, engage in a huge amount of recreational drug use when you're 15. Or with the fast food thing, it's if you just eat fast food every day, 3 meals a day, you're going to end up fat. And that comes with a lot of unpleasant aspects, like your life expectancy is going to be a lot shorter, you're going to have a bunch of comorbidities which reduce quality of life, all sorts of future effects that you're not going to enjoy. And for a certain group of people, our current model of restraining desire works. But then there are a lot of people for whom, so you were saying your experience in the military, you met people who had some sort of religion which constrained their desire. That was a function
kind of
constrained desire. I think to people's benefit.
There's one more element here. So yes, school, yes, military. I also, I used to work, like, when I first graduated college, I worked like a corporate job, and, as like kind of a suit and tie guy in a skyscraper and everything. And, I did that for like 5 years. And I then quit and worked on oil rigs as a laborer in West Virginia. And that's actually where I was when Trump came down the escalator, as it were. So I'd been living I think I started in like 2014. I was, living in truck stops in West Virginia for about a year and a half with my rig crew, and we were drilling holes that would later be basically fracked. And I would be out there for 2 weeks at a time, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So I was living in Philadelphia, so I'd drive back and forth. It was like a 6-hour drive. That is actually, even more than the military, where I really became exposed to, because through my coworkers, the culture difference was so enormous, where I didn't know people like that were missing teeth, basically, in my life. But like in West Virginia and among my coworkers, like people would be missing limbs. They would be like my mentor was missing, from his knee down on his right leg because of a steel mill. A coil of steel fell on his leg, and he was helivac'd out and had to have it amputated. One of my rig managers was missing 3 fingers on his right hand from this old practice of what they call throwing chain, where they used to spin pipes with chains and just ripped his freaking fingers right off. And then so many people were missing teeth. Because I would ask why, and they said, I just didn't brush my teeth. That's just it. Almost everyone lived in trailers, even though they were making $100,000 or $120,000 a year. They would live in double wide trailers on big properties, sometimes not. And they would have a bunch of vehicles. They'd have big truck payment. They'd have ATVs. They'd go on big hunting trips, or sometimes they just had kids, or sometimes they drank it away or gambled it away. But there were. It was more likely you didn't graduate high school than did any college among these people. I lied, and told people that I'd gone to a little bit of college or something like that. I think I told the job interview, I told them I'd been to college and I'd been in the military, but mostly I just kind of associate. I was in the National Guard, which is not even a full-time military commitment. It's just 2 week, 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. But they associated me with the military. And still I was able to hack it there, but I do not come from a blue collar background. Like, I didn't know how to put grease in a grease gun. I got hired there because there was a boom in fracking, and because I'd been in the military. That was it. But anyway, that's where I was when Trump came down the escalator, as it were. And I, again, was like this is where my transformation from centrist liberal into more of a right winger happened, because I went to a pretty good undergraduate as Ivy League, and I had my Facebook. I was probably one of the first 10,000 people on Facebook, because they only opened to certain school. They only opened to like Princeton, Yale, Penn, Harvard at first, my Facebook in 2015 was a mix of these enlisted soldiers from the military, who were, multicultural. I was in, a lot of black guys, Hispanic guys, white guys. My, classmates from undergrad who were, also relatively multicultural. And then these people I knew from West Virginia in the oil field. And the polarization of class and education on the Trump issue was every day playing out in my social media life. And I was seeing, just these, very educated, extremely privileged, and extremely unself-consciously privileged crowd at the higher end of society has kind of adopted this vocabulary of oppression and, this kind of understanding of the concepts. And they're a lot more like fluid in their ability to identify or misidentify, frankly, what seems like, oppression and kind of like injustice. And then, you see, and so they're all, roughly in alignment with the kind of establishmentarian, like Democratic, candidate at the time, Hillary Clinton, who, I don't hate her. I don't have the big problem with her either, but I was, the Trump supporters in my feed were the ones like maimed by industrial accidents and, like with these true, like messed up lives where, part of it, a lot of it was their own fault. Like a lot of it was, it's alcohol and drugs. And one guy had a great story. It's not a great, I don't know how to describe it, but, this guy had the story where he was dating this bartender and he was just drinking, probably 30 drinks over the course of a night or something. He's probably 5'6", red-haired, fool from West Virginia, to be frank. And I love the guy, but that's what he is. And, he is leaving the bar and he's so drunk he can't even walk. And, this bartender woman's taking him to the car and some guy, says something to him. And he gets into the car and they get on the highway, and he then processes that this man just challenged him. So they're now on the highway, right? And this guy's like, "Hey, fuck you." And he gets up and he opens the door and steps out onto the highway as the car is moving and just tumbles into the and so
it's a very short-term strategy, that one.
And so, it's like, just, is this guy a fool? Because I don't know, but my point is like this guy's a great guy. He got a DUI. I had to drive him to the rig one time because he got a freaking DUI one time. We were out, living out of his truck stops, and he's going to a bar, and he gets a DUI in the morning, overnight, and he's still. I wake up in the morning in the motel. I'm like, "What are you doing here?" And he goes, "Oh, I can remember. My goose is cooked. My goose is cooked. This is my third one. Oh boy, this is the one that gets you." And it is. That's the third DUIs where they start like, I think you got to go to jail, and there's all kinds of stuff. But it's probably, it's paying for the lawyers $7-10 grand. And I'm like, well, what'd you drink? And he's like, I had 3 beers. And I'm like, well, then how'd you get a DUI? He's like, they were 3 of the big fuckers, and he used his hands to indicate like a freaking, meter tall beer. But so anyway, this guy was a capable worker to some extent, but he's not making the right decisions. He never is. It's often because of drugs and alcohol. He's, just be perfectly frank, he's not that bright to begin with. And this system is not really working for this guy. And there are like millions of people like this. And I'm not trying to penalize these people. I love these people. I love spending time with them. I love hanging out and, chatting with guys like this, and they're just wonderful. And by the way, the women are a whole different world too. But I just don't believe that, this system, they're just not there. Like it's just, and I don't know if they ever are going to be, and I don't think that they even want to be. So anyway, there's just a lot of guys like that out there. But anyway, so that's, and of course that guy is a Trump supporter. You know what I mean? And I don't actually remember if he is, but a number of the people were. It was just happening. It was just, this is 2015. And, people were just starting to catch on to this like irreverency associated with Trump and this kind of middle finger to the liberal establishment. And so these guys are slow to pick up on that in the first place, although they all have Facebook. And these are the kind of guys that have like me and my wife's Facebook page, where there's like 2 people have 1 page kind of guy. And it was just starting to filter down to them. I was a lot more engaged and had already picked up. And at the time I was actually, I actually didn't really go to the right at that point. I kind of was migrating towards like the Bernie Sanders orientation. And, I had already, because I already like loved these guys. Like before Trump showed up, I already had this kind of structure in my mind that like there are these working class Americans of all races, kind of Martin Luther King Jr., like the Poor People's March, as it were. There are these people of all backgrounds that are hilarious, and they just would not fit in. And by the way, by hilarious, I don't mean I'm laughing at them, although sometimes I am. But they're just like, they're wonderful people. And there's like there's this kind of strong sense of family and clan and place, and all these kind of, maybe scary, kind of nationalist ideas about they are a bit less mobile. They're a bit less educated. They're a bit less engaged with modernity. And so that's why reactionaries, I think, tend to like this group, because they're just less corrupted in this Rousseauian sense by modernity. I am not in love with that element. I just think that they are cool and just like they add value, and they're just, they're human. But anyway, seeing my Facebook feed, I was very much, even I didn't support Trump, but I was like, wait a minute, there is something going on here where all of the like Wall Street guys I know are like, in favor of, this cultural movement, that I think is roughly hostile to the true kind of victims of the liberal situation. So anyway, it's actually a lot more of that than it is teaching. I then came to teaching much later in my, I don't know, not much later, but a bit later, and I've certainly learned from that. But a lot of my understanding of liberalism happened through the military and the oil field.
It does sound like a lot of that is how do people relate to desire, and how does the prevailing system provide them with avenues to indulge their desires and also ways to constrain desire? And like, for say, you talking about the Wall Street people supporting in 2016 Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, yeah,
It could be that, at least in part, and there are subtleties to this that I'm leaving out at the moment, but that the vision of the future offered by more establishment liberalism in the United States is a more unconstrained approach to desire, or to certain desires, which, if you're able to basically regulate your desires and have a longer term view of your behavior, you can interact with. So say like cannabis legalization.
yep,
If it say if it were made legal here, I don't like how it makes me feel
me
slow
too.
and dopey.
Exactly,
And like
exactly.
it's
I hate
not
it.
actually going to make a material difference to me if it's legal or not.
Right.
But it's like, I definitely know people who will wake and bake when it's illegal, and if it were even more widely available, it actually just would make their lives worse.
Yeah. And then, but by the way, and then there's people like, the guy who I was describing in the oil field, who just like bombard themselves with these, experiences regardless of the consequences. Some of them have kids and are responsible for more than just themselves. Like, it's really not good for that kind of guy.
So at least part of the project of looking beyond liberalism, to my mind, and I think this is implicit in a number of your reviews, is basically ways to encourage good behavior or to constrain desire or to channel desire other than trying to educate it out of people at school.
Yep.
Which seems to be much of the current model. So you have people in school, you tell them not to do things.
Yep.
Because,
And it's understandable.
They won't get a good job. But I think certain people need other forms of desire constraint than just being told at school, don't do this.
Well, one thing you do learn as a teacher, and this goes counter to the kind of right-wing narrative on schools, is the kids aren't listening anyway. The idea that like there's this trans indoctrination, left-wing indoctrination happening in schools, it's like, well, first of all, it's really not happening. Like I've taught in, big city public school systems. But even if it were, they're not listening. So,
In fact, the teacher telling them to do it or encouraging them to do it might actually make them less enthusiastic.
Well, I get what you're saying there. That's kind of true too. Like there is adolescent rebellion, right? But in a weird way, teachers and adults do have an influence over adolescents, even in spite of the rebellion too. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Part of the thing is though, like maybe someone like you or someone like me, we're not like ideas aren't as relevant to everyone as we kind of think they are. You know what I'm saying? Like, so that's the other thing. It's like a lot of the left-wing indoctrination, it's like a lot of people don't even have the framework to receive it. Let's put it that way. You know what I'm saying?
So do you have a feeling for what a post-liberal society would look like? Because there are plenty of avenues it could go.
Yeah.
In that I don't think liberalism is eternal. I think it's an idea. There are plenty of aspects of liberalism that I really like.
Me too.
But it's just the basic observation that you look at basically any human belief or any way that humans have organized societies over a long enough time period, it changes. That's what I find most interesting about people looking beyond liberalism, is that the liberalism of today and the liberalism of 1800 in the United Kingdom are different. Like even what we call liberalism has evolved significantly.
The cultural assumptions are different.
But what would do you have a feeling for what a post-liberal society would look like, say, in the United States? And this can be descriptive or proscriptive. Like you can say, oh, well, I think it should be this, or I think it's going to be this. You can take this in any direction you want.
Yeah. So I don't think it's going to. I think the United States is. I don't. Look. I often am wrong about my predictions. I always say so. I don't know. Let's just put that out there.
Yeah, preface
But
it with that.
here's what I think should happen. And so one more quick caveat here. Liberalism, if you kind of pay attention to Moldbug and actually Slate Star Codex, Scott Alexander, who we talked about before the podcast, he has a really interesting long form piece from a long time ago called Reactionary Philosophy in a Giant Universe-Sized Nutshell or something like that. But these guys bring up that liberalism is the water in which we swim. And you mentioned that in a previous podcast, and I think you're right. It's kind of it's almost the religious assumption. So in as far as, let's say, Spain was religiously Catholic in the 15th, 16th century, whatever, think of liberalism as the equivalent of like medieval Catholicism in Europe, right? It's hard for most citizens to even imagine a world outside of it. So when talking about post-liberalism or something that is illiberal, you are almost talking in satanic terms in medieval Europe. You know what I mean? So you have to be able to understand
occultism to it.
Yeah, and there's this is and part of the job of liberalism, and not just liberalism, but whatever your dominant ideology is to rule competitor ideologies out. And so it's to stigmatize them, make them seem like they're wrong or stupid or evil or all these things. So as we go into this conversation, we are talking about things that the dominant philosophical idea of the time is going to make you feel are evil, right? And so in order to talk about them, I just want, listeners or whoever to understand, we unfortunately, in this kind of Nietzschean sense, we have to be willing to go into the sandbox, which is what Substack and the Salon, the kind of Salon system of Paris, but, podcasts like this, we need to be able to experiment with ideas, right? But not necessarily implement them or whatever, right? So anyway, all of that is a caveat. I think probably we need a kind of sort of differentiation of citizenship. And I don't know if that's based on IQ. I don't know if that's based on some other kind of measure, but roughly, I think there need to be tiers. And so what I'm not saying is a caste system or actually, I don't know what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that, so there's a number of people who I love and think are wonderful and have spent my professional life engaging with in one way or another, who this system I believe is not working for, whatsoever, right? I think that the reforms aimed at making life easier for them are not working, and I think they're never going to work because of the liberal structure, which ultimately requires a lot of agency, more agency than we can kind of expect from even myself. I don't feel like I'm a super agentic. I think that's a word person. So there's that. That said, we don't want to lose liberalism's dynamism, and we don't want to lose its appeal to the super capable and these kind of Elon Musk characters who, again, I don't agree with his philosophies. I think he's roughly just a kind of Randian atheist. And I don't agree with him. That said, I don't want to throw him out. And I think these ambitious, brilliant strivers, we need to incorporate them just as a public high school needs to incorporate the honors cohort of students, right? And in order to do that, we can't get in their way. They are engaging with science and reading and all these things so much that, when you're a teacher, the approach to the honors group is to just backle what you kind of give some material and you allow the room to process it and you allow the kids to talk and you don't have these super strict approach to sit in your seat and be quiet and all this stuff. And it's just how I think any teacher who teaches, different rooms understands the approach is different. And so equality in terms of a human sense is real, and that's in my view, the Catholic foundation. Catholic means universal, and so there's certainly a universal kind of spiritual human equality between people. But I think if I'm imagining like a kind of a system that serves everyone a little bit better, it's one that differentiates between needs. And again, that's that could so a critic might say that's caste or that's class or that's whatever. I do think moving into the future, differentiation is modernization. When things become more specific and more kind of tailored to individual interest and individual ability, this is an improvement on undifferentiated, whatever, undifferentiated. If an idea is undifferentiated, you're not being specific enough, and you don't have like a clear understanding. So anyway, I thought even more about this, like not really. If I had more time, I would spend time like writing on this project, like what does a differentiated kind of post-liberal like political system look like? That said, I've just got, I've got book reviews, I've got my own fiction that I'm writing. And so I just don't and I've got a son, and I've got a, I work out, and I've got a job, and I've got a dog and chickens and all this stuff. But anyway, so that's the answer, I believe, is differentiation. How we do that without, also keep in mind, previous versions of differentiation are unacceptable. So in France, again, I'm a Catholic. I think the revolution, French Revolution had a lot of major problems, and I'm ultimately like not thrilled about it. That said, as far as I understand, like the taxes were all being paid by the peasantry. The privileges associated with aristocracy, made them quite haughty. I even heard a story recently. Yeah, a coworker of mine was telling me a story in England where, I think during Cromwell, there was, King Charles II or something was like on the run, and he was trying to get out and get to France, and he had to he dressed himself as like like in livery at some point, as if he were like a servant or of a aristocrat. And on the road they pulled over and they ran into another aristocrat, and the king like addressed him in livery, and the guy smacked him and knocked him down. Said basically, don't you dare speak to me, like that. And apparently when King Charles, I believe it's King Charles, I don't know the name, but when the king kind of returns to the throne eventually and Cromwell's gone, he summons this guy who knocked him down and was basically like, roughly like, good work, like that's how you're supposed to treat, peasantry. I'm glad, even though you did it to me, and like I think even gave him like property and like have rewarded him for this behavior. And so as funny as that is, I don't agree with that. Like, I think there has to be a culture of egalitarianism, a kind of, where your plumber or whatever is not just some fool. Like this is a person with interiority and with a whole family and life, and he's got awesome skills, and there shouldn't be this looking down. So I agree with the egalitarian impulse in that sense. That said, I think there needs to be a differentiated kind of sense of citizenship in a different way in terms of what that guy's rights and responsibilities are.
It sounds to me that you've identified, so it's one of these first principles of liberalism, that everyone is to be treated in the same way.
Yeah.
In not in all things, because if you exist in a meritocracy, or at least in something that's nominally a meritocracy, people in the end aren't treated the same. But at least legally, it's seen as immoral to have laws that apply to different people in different ways. And
which I can understand, which I
part
respect, like that liberal
And
morality. Like I get being attached to liberal morality. Like I myself am to some extent.
yeah, it's but it's just one of those interesting things, though. Even as a thought experiment, to think, okay, well, what if you don't have this constraint? What can you do? What can society look like? Which, like you said earlier, because part of the job of any large ideology is basically to see off any sort of competitors.
Yep.
There can be discomfort associated with that if you've lived your
Yes.
entire life in a liberal system. But
Exactly.
it's part of your project that I find interesting. I basically find anyone trying to look over the horizon interesting in this way.
The funny thing is,
One
we
thing I do
barely
want
even
to...
talked. The funny thing is, we
Oh,
barely
sorry,
even
go on.
talked about fiction. And you know, my feeling is like I actually am not the post-liberal like political science guy. Like I have a rough understanding of it, and I'm roughly kind of convinced by it. But you know, my actual project is then to take all of, you know, in the same way a Marxist literary critic is, you know, then applying these concepts to literature. You know, my sphere is fiction. You know, and so I'm actually not the one dreaming. You know, I'm not the one kind of planning, let's say, what the next world will look like. I'm just applying the post-liberal, you know, kind of philosophy to literary criticism and understanding of literature, you know.
Yeah, well, so you asked me to read a chapter, The Piper at the Gates
Yes.
of
Oh,
Dawn, from The Wind in
yeah,
the
yeah.
Willows.
Yeah. I
So
forgot about that.
why was it that you asked me to read that? And it's a very beautiful
Have you read
chapter
that book or
for a
no?
number of reasons. But why was it that you asked me to read that one?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh my God. I'm actually so glad we're going to talk about that. I completely forgot. So yeah, right. Getting back to literature in general. So anyway, just a transition from philosophy and religion to literature. You know, I'm a spiritual person. I'm going to go to church today. I believe in God and all these things. And for me, like, you know, one of the things about fiction is kind of being able to capture these experiences in text, and in order to, you know, in order to kind of share these experiences with others. And that Piper at the Gates of Dawn chapter, which is chapter 7 of Wind in the Willows, in which you know, Mole and Ratty go and find little what's his name, Portly, I think. Portly, the
Yeah,
lost
Portly, that's
otter
right.
child.
Yeah.
But there's this kind of capture of this experience of like pagan, you know, spirituality, in which Pan, who the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, would be Pan, who is a who I incidentally referenced in my Caudell thing. But Pan is this kind of goat god, you know, associated with fertility and kind of nature, and he plays the pan pipes, you know. And there's this, in my opinion, this beautiful capture of pagan spirituality, which again, I'm not, you know, I'm a Catholic, so that's all very bad to me. But what I do like about it is its willingness to go into the spiritual, you know, and the experience of spirituality, and in a way that is accessible, that isn't a children's story, that is perfectly like comprehensible to, I don't know if you're secular or not, but I think that, you know, if you are, it becomes apparent, even, you know, a person who doesn't have a spiritual perspective is able to apprehend what the experience is like. And so, I don't know. It's just, it's me. It's also got all these elements, all these, we were talking earlier about these kind of connotative elements of like, we like little talking animals. We like the natural world. We like music. We like kind of just rowing along, you know, a kind of lazy river all night. Just all of these images and associations are just so positive. And then plus the spiritual capture, I just think it's just one of my favorite scenes in all of literature that I've read.
The way he establishes an inner state to lead up to the sense of awe
Right.
of seeing Pan is remarkable, because he's bringing in all of these experiences that are really magical for so many people. So seeing a river in moonlight,
Yep.
is something that it does feel magical for anyone who's experienced that. The sound of water in reeds,
Yes.
all of these things slowly building up this sense of awe that he then transmutes into this sense of awe when they see Pan
Yes.
is remarkable. It was a very, very transporting section.
And then the end of the chapter where, he's listening, he's kind of like transcribing, he's kind of translate. You can hear the panpipes playing. I forget if it's rat or mole, but like, he's kind of listening. He's kind of saying the poem to the other character. And then he's, oh wait, I can kind of hear it. Let me listen a little bit deeper, more carefully. And the next thing, the other character looks and then he's asleep. And there's that, that kind of like drifting off, which I don't know. It also seemed very like just well done, well executed to me.
And this is an aspect of fiction that I find extremely valuable. And I think I certainly know a number of people who only read nonfiction because they see fiction as a waste of time.
Yeah.
But I think this evocation of an inner experience or inner transportation is something that fiction, when it's done well, and it's hard to do, but when it's done well, offers that nonfiction really doesn't. And while the lessons you get from it are much vaguer than, say, I don't know, learning how to do marketing from a marketing book.
Yep.
They're just as real. In some ways, it's almost it informs the substrate within which any more declarative thoughts of yours can grow.
Right, exactly.
They're lessons on a much, much more subterranean level.
I think that, I think this is kind of, I don't know, the word culture is like abused. And if you read, there's a really good, I think it's T.S. Eliot who has notes towards the definition of culture. It's a really, really important essay to read on this because he defines culture, and it's like kind of associated with a religion. Roughly, it doesn't have. He's a Christian, but he doesn't. There can be a culture associated with Hinduism or pagan things or whatever. But roughly, I think when Wind in the Willows was written, there was a lot more of that framework to receive, kind of spiritual experience in literature. And I think like you and me can now, but I think people are less, slightly less primed to be able to even receive this kind of thing. Where, I don't know, if you read things from the distant past, there's kind of cultural things where it's like you don't even understand how to recognize it, or understand how to contextualize it, make sense of it, because the culture of whatever ancient Rome or something is so foreign to you. I'm not, again, I've got an optimistic view. I'm a kind of weird, conservative religious person who's got optimism about the future. But, and so I don't believe secular, I don't think the world is going secularizing in ways that are going to destroy religion. But, and secularization, I think, is probably good ultimately in some ways, because I think it's going to lead to, I don't know if, I've written this on Substack. I've used this example a number of times, but there's this book called The Hand of God by a guy named Bernard Nathanson, who was a secular Jewish abortion doctor in the United States in the 1970s, and he was central in advocating for the legalization of abortion. And he, at some point, decided, oh my God, this is, we can't do this anymore. And he became a Catholic. And he's describing this experience of, where he had his change. It was in the 1970s when the ultrasound technology happened. And he suddenly could see an image of a human fetus trying to avoid his utensils, and they were trying to get away from the basically the blade and the vacuum. And he said he was not spiritual whatsoever. It was just simply seeing this image of this little human, being torn to bits, that he just said, and oh my, it was an instantaneous change. And, my view is that Catholicism, probably does have some problems, but I think roughly on the big moral questions, it's like, it's right. And further development of technology is only just going to help us understand that better. And the example of Bernard Nathanson is one instantiation of how I kind of think that that's going to happen. The more you learn about the world, the more you understand that life is kind of like, whoa, this is like kind of something not to really play around with. But anyway, I don't know. I don't remember what we were talking about now for some reason, but I'm babbling.
Talk about it, the ability of literature to particularly convey internal
right.
experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so I think that
this really an incredible form of empathy.
Yeah. So so it does feel to me like, in England, and I don't exactly remember when this book was written, Wind of the Willows, but there's just a lot more, internal kind of infrastructure that was passed on by education and families to receive the spiritual, message, no matter what it is. And I don't know if have you ever heard of the author named Paul Kingsnorth?
No, I haven't come across him.
He's got a Substack. I just went to a thing where he spoke. I got to meet him last weekend, actually. Him and Ennis Lyons and another, this guy Matt Crawford has got a big Substack. But Kingsnorth wrote this article about his conversion from kind of secular. He's like a Wiccan, I think, kind of environmental leftist, and now he's kind of Eastern Orthodox Christian. He lives in Ireland, but he's English, and he has this really interesting long form article for First Things magazine called "The Cross and the Machine." And in it, he describes his childhood where, he grew up in the 80s or something in England. And he had like a Pakistani friend or a friend from, the East. And their family was really religious, Muslim or something. And he remarked it felt un-English to be religious, even in the 80s and 90s. It felt superstitious and kind of quaint and it was allowed because they're this almost exotic family that they're immigrants and they didn't have the native culture, which is of course kind of secular and oriented towards progressivism, and I grew up that way basically. I'm from a Catholic family, but there's the emphasis, no one could articulate the ideas really, and maybe my stepfather could to some extent, but there's more of a an emphasis, and I don't mean this in a critical way, but there's definitely more of an emphasis on engaging with the world as it is, with school and career and those things, and in that way, because of that, some of this other stuff, the spiritual side, it suffers. And it's just not as culturally relevant as it may have been in the 1950s or 40s or whatever. But again, I don't mean that as a doom and gloom kind of statement from my perspective. I think the stuff is natural and developmentally appropriate.
Yeah. Do you think then that, at least for some writers, is their role to provide an internal framework for receiving, say, spirituality or something else like that?
I guess so. I think that most writers are working in a tradition, and if your tradition is kind of secular progressivism, then probably no. But that's another reason I don't expect to have a big following, or I think some of these mass writers are speaking to more mass traditions than I feel like I'll ever be associated with, you know what I mean? But so I think we kind of have to pick a tribe and just and write to and for that tribe roughly, So, but yeah, so anyway, to answer your question, yes, I do think for some writers, probably, yeah, for, and for others, maybe not.
One thing I was wanting to ask you about was how you approach prose, because particularly in your more recent reviews, you're really, really focusing on prose quite a lot. And you say in your On a Levy review, you were talking
Mm-hmm.
about this particular style, which is a midpoint between poetry and prose,
Mm-hmm.
which Levy did, you said, reasonably well.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other authors like, for example, Nabokov,
Mm-hmm.
who does it remarkably well. What is it? What are the characteristics of this particular style? Who do you think does it really well? Because you were very laudatory of this highly
Yeah.
poetic prose style.
Yeah. Euphony, basically, euphonic prose, which just sounds good. Good phone sound. Yeah, there's a lot. There's not as many as there should be. For many years, I try to direct all my reading, all my research and reading into like who are the authors like this. And so I guess the top of the pile would be Joyce. And for me, it was Gerard Manley Hopkins. If you know, he's a poet. He's not a prose fiction writer, but James Joyce, especially in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Where there's just an embrace of euphony of sound. Then also, I think that it's hard to like tie this down. It's kind of sound. It's kind of just like beauty in general. There's Walt Whitman is kind of like this. I think that the author of Moby Dick, whose name is Melville, Herman Melville, is a really, really strong writer of just prose level writing. I think that what's his name? Kenneth Graham, Wyndham Williams does a pretty good job. But the spectacular authors are, Joyce and, Shakespeare is writing verse, but there's some, in my view, there's some really, especially his sonnets, I think, actually. I'm much more interested in Shakespearean sonnets than I am in the plays. But there are moments in the plays, that To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, of course, I think sounds really nice. And again, it is a merger of poetry too. So there is also Gerard Manley Hopkins, I think, is very beautiful writer, if you're familiar with him. And Melville and what's his name? Mark Twain has some really nice stuff, if you believe it. I don't know. Off the top of my head, that's what I think of.
Because it's easy to get wrong, because you've been reasonably critical of Cormac McCarthy, or at least saying that you think he's overrated. And he does write in quite a florid, poetic way, at least in some of his books. Things like The Road are much more more constrained. So what is it that, say, McCarthy's doing and getting wrong, if you're able to put your finger on it, that someone like Melville is getting right? And I say this as someone who has never really liked McCarthy's works a huge amount.
So, all right. So McCarthy, as I think I mentioned, I described this in the Improvidence review. Like, I just think he's, that kind of low definition versus high definition thing where, Thomas Mann, who's hard for me to evaluate his prose because he's writing in German and I don't speak German. So I'm reading English translations. But where, what's his name? I'm sorry, Thomas Mann is very, it's just like, it's a mixture of just like IQ and artistic sensibility where he's able to, he understands, like, again, like ARX-Han is kind of like this too, where he's able to capture like scientific or biological processes or psychological processes in the part of, in Han's case, but like make it literary in a sense. And that's just, I'm sure I don't know, when I try and write, I don't always try and do that because it's just not my strength, but I'm like impressed by people that can, and where they can just go deep and like almost on a cellular level describe what's happening. Whereas with Cormac McCarthy, kind of like I mentioned, there are pace is very important, and in commercial and genre fiction. And I don't want to sound like a snob because I do like these things. I do like Cormac McCarthy. Like I said, he's like, I actually do like Blood Meridian. But there's never a time when you're just like, wow, Cormac McCarthy like really just like opened my eyes to like the biological process of falling in love. It's like it's just like, it's more like, wow, Cormac McCarthy has written like a paragraph long sentence with like the word "and" appearing like 13 times, and like a bunch of like archaic, like sometimes frankly ridiculous vocabulary items appearing, and creating this kind of like stilted tone that like later just gets called like biblical, as if that it's like, well, yeah, it's biblical in like a weird, like ancient, like sense of like people still reading the King James version of the Bible, which is, with thys and thous, because it like has this like reactionary prestige associated with it. But like, to me, it's like, if a student handed in work like this, I'd be like, what the hell are you doing? Like this is called a run-on sentence. Like, why aren't there any commas? And so I just think that I think his style is preening and a bit overly like masculine. It's this kind of like male vanity in a prose sense, where it's reaction against probably kind of feminized like purple prose, but it's just like masculinized purple prose, and I don't think that's like a redeeming element. I guess I'm not really being specific enough here, but I don't know. I just think Cormac McCarthy is kind of just overrated.
Then what about, there are other, actually, there's a prose style that I find you get from people like Thomas Pynchon or David Foster Wallace, this almost mathematical, hysterical kitchen sink prose style that I quite enjoy it. I like particularly that highly punctuated
Which Pynchon are you talking about?
Sort of which Pynchon?
Yeah.
Sort of Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon one. So like late Pynchon, when he wrote, I think his most recent book was basically a detective novel, which is much more stripped down. But like,
wait, what was that one
Pynchon
called?
at his most florid.
What was the most recent one called? It was like the Silicon Valley one, right?
I think Inherent Vice.
Yes.
Think.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Did you read that one?
Yeah, I did.
What did you think of it?
So if it were written by someone else, I probably would have enjoyed it a lot more, because I went into it expecting to feel like I was becoming schizophrenic. I enjoyed it less. In some ways, he has such a singular style, or he's so known for a very particular type of novel that it almost is, he'd need to write under a pseudonym for me to enjoy his later works in the same way that I've enjoyed his earlier works.
Did you find it to be full of the same effort as you kind of associate with his earlier works?
No, both in terms of I didn't have to put in the same effort, because it's just so much more clear and less convoluted. But also, it seemed like less effort because it's not a 900-page monster with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of named characters.
Right. Well, I remember I listened to it when I used to have a blue collar drilling job, although not the one in West Virginia. And so I don't have a perfect like recollection of. I don't have a perfect recollection of. I don't even have a good recollection of books I've read or listened to a long time ago. But so this one I probably listened to in 2018. Let's say, while I was like, sweeping up like a construction office yard kind of thing and doing jobs around there. I remember not liking it really. I remember I was living in Silicon Valley. I was actually living, he kept referencing like, venture capitalists and Sand Hill Road. And I lived like within walking distance of like where he was describing. I don't know. I just remember being like, this guy this is, I don't know. My recollection was it was a kind of lazy book trying to cash in on contemporary like trends, in this case, Silicon Valley and the internet, without like a super strong understanding of them and without the ability to make them seem like kind of edgy and cool. You know what I mean? It's like an old man kind of doing a like fellow kids meme, thing. That's how it struck me. But that style, so talking about the David Foster Wallace and Pynchon kind of prose like from his heyday, so again, I actually think that kind of falls into the more high definition prose. Like I'm not the biggest fan of either of these guys, but it's not like I certainly respect people who are, and I think they're good. David Foster Wallace, I actually kind of don't. I more actively don't like because the book is just so. It's just this tome about like addiction and depression and all these kind of like, discursions on like media theory in this like kind of grad school like tenor, and I don't know, it's not super impressive to me, but there is that high definition like capture of various things going on. There is the ability to stop and describe a scene for like a series of pages, and so in that regard, I think it's good. Yeah, I like that. And certainly the same thing, Pynchon.
Yeah, with things, with people like Pynchon at his what I think it was his peak, that sort of Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon, Crying of Lot 49 era, and Wallace when he was being the least restrained, like with Infinite Jest. I really enjoy them, but they're the sort of authors where when someone says, I really don't like them, I just think like, yeah, fair enough. That all of these criticisms are valid. I can't disagree. Yeah. I just like it.
Yeah, and I guess I have the reverse perspective where like when I read them, I'm like, wow, there is a lot going on here. You know what I mean? And it kind of reminds me like I was like in high school a huge Radiohead fan, but like I understand people who weren't connecting there. But there's never anyone who's like Radiohead sucks. There's just like, oh wow, that's a whole universe that I'm not sure I'm like plugged into. Actually, now I think about it, having read the first few chapters of your book, you've got a bit of a Pynchon thing going on there. Actually, now that I think about it,
I might have read him at the right time because I read him a lot in my sort of late teens, early 20s. And I think I haven't read him for years. I think that it just set.
Yeah, I bet.
I particularly like it when fantastical things start creeping into otherwise fairly normal renditions of how we live. That might be part of the reason why I love Kafka so much.
Oh yeah.
That he's
well, yeah, you've got that going on too. The hat, it's like, yeah.
Yeah, his ability to depict what really seems like fairly mundane reality, but there's just something off. There'll be certain aspects of it will just be more exaggerated, not so exaggerated that it feels fantastical, but exaggerated enough that it's deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Of course, you do have some frankly fantastical aspects, like Gregor Samsa awaking one morning to find himself an enormous insect. It is a real shame that I don't speak German, and I can't read it in German.
Do you speak any other languages?
I speak Czech, and the aspect of the German language, which apparently Kafka makes fantastic use of, is that you leave a lot of information to the end of the sentences, so particularly verbs, I think, occur at the end of a sentence.
Okay.
So to German speakers, if I'm butchering this, I apologize. So there's this constant tension that's released at the end of the sentence. And Czech, like many Slavic languages, has quite a loose word order. So you can replicate that fairly easily within the Czech grammatical structure. So I probably should read him in Czech. Actually, it'd probably work.
You're that strong with Czech?
It'd take me longer to read than in English, but
Right.
yeah, I could.
Wow, that's really impressive.
He's a remarkable author, one that I can't evaluate on a prose level for the reasons I just said. But
although his prose, actually, to me, I actually kind of disagree with you there. I feel like he is so methodical, and one of the things that's wonderful about his prose is that that train of logic from sentence to sentence. You are going idea A to B to C to D to E to where it's like a puzzle pieces put together.
That's a very good point. So there are.
I guess it's hard. There are few authors like that.
Yeah, you're really right. You miss certain things in translation, but almost the mathematics of someone's prose can come through quite well. And yeah, you're right. He has this almost autistic logic to approaching situations, but the situations will be. There's always some fundamental absurdity that he still approaches quite logically, like in the castle. Looking for, I think the bureaucrat's name is Clam, and just this maddening search for Clam, who might get Kay into the castle, and he doesn't even know why.
I've never read that one.
It's
great.
It truly feels like you're going insane. That he applies this painstaking logic to a fundamentally absurd situation, which is it's just fantastic. The fact that I don't think he ever finished any of his novels either. They're all unfinished, but I actually can't imagine anything more fitting than that they are all unfinished, because I just don't know how these situations really resolve anyway. I guess the trial ends fairly concretely.
Is that the one where the guy is basically being tortured kind of on an island somewhere in the torture machine?
No, the trial ends, spoilers, but I guess, this book was released in the 19th century, so...
Yeah, right.
I guess spoilers aside, but no, they just I think two representatives of some governmental body just come and execute him.
Oh wow! Which is the one that takes place on which is one that takes place on a penal servitude island thing with torture?
I'm not sure. I've read of his books. I've read The Castle, The Trial, America, and then short stories. He did have a number of short stories.
This was a short story.
Could easily have not read that one.
Well, isn't he
was very strong when it came to short stories, because I guess what really attracts me to Kafka and J.G. Ballard, who's another author that I've
never read
really
him,
but
I've heard you guys talk about him.
I like him a lot, particularly his works from the first half of the 1970s. So The Atrocity Exhibition, Concrete Island, Crash, High Rise. I'm attracted to for similar reasons as to Kafka, in that he's almost a novelist of the inner logic of a situation, or the mathematics of a situation, in that all of his characters are strangely without volition. They're quite blank. And similar to actually a lot of Kafka's characters, they're often quite unagentic. Where the novel is interesting is in the unfolding of the logic of some sort of situation, whether it's this intense death erotic reproductionism of Crash, or the inner logic of a high-rise complex in High Rise, or the inner logic of a bureaucratic judicial process in The Trial. That's something that I've always found very, very attractive and interesting in fiction. And it's something quite hard to
replicate,
to evaluate in something other than fiction.
Oh, I see. Yeah. He is one of these authors where you can tell it's a lot of kind of thought labor going into the production of the written product.
Fairly strange man too. Apparently Kafka kept his neighbors awake because he wrote at night, and they would hear him
Uh-huh.
laughing so loudly at the things he was writing that he'd wake them up.
That's actually like really, that's like total white pill, like, clear pill or whatever. Like, that's like, wow, that's great. You like to
Yeah,
hear
it's just
people having
like,
fun.
what are you meant to do with this information? This guy is
Right.
very strange. Be a very strange interiority to occupy.
I just
But
like
that's,
hearing people having fun, I'm glad he was having fun.
Talking about the strangely blank characters in Kafka and J.G. Ballard actually reminded me. I do want to ask you what makes characters in novels interesting to you? Because you've got two reviews
Oh,
that
yeah.
I think
Yeah.
something interesting is happening with. One is of Castro's The Novelist, and the other is of Caleb Caudell's The Neighbour. And so in The Novelist, you really don't like how childish the protagonist is.
Yeah.
And how flawed he is, and this is really irritating you. But then in The Neighbour by Caudell, a number of the characters, or I think basically all the characters, are very, very flawed people too. And I guess you could say there is some childishness to them in that they have minimal impulse control and consistently make very, very short-term self-destructive decisions.
Yes.
And struggle to live with those consequences. So what is it that makes a character interesting or engaging to you? Because it doesn't seem to be flaws, because you were very, very laudatory of Caudell's work, The Neighbour. What is it that makes them interesting
Okay.
to you, that
So
makes those characters work?
I'm gonna be honest. I hope that I've got a like ideologically coherent answer here, but I might not. It might
doesn't need to be ideologically coherent.
So what it might be is just bias. So part of my own intellectual kind of evolution has been a bit more of like, I'm just nicer to these people who I think are like victims of the kind of contemporary society, and so I don't view Jordan Castro, who I think is probably a wonderful guy. He's like a Catholic. He's this wonderful article right now in Plow magazine on his kind of, he was a heroin addict and he kind of became a Catholic, and he's a similar background to me, at least, where did not believe these things and then kind of later learned to. But so I just feel bad that, like, it's, by the way, it's also like my most viewed Substack article. Of course, it's this one where I trash this. Yeah, of course. What used to be the Han one, but no, the Jordan Castro one has gone far. It's going to and continues to get views. So I feel bad. I also like don't live that far from him. It's like just not out of the question that I run into him in person, like at some point like within the year. Maybe not the year, but sooner or later, I wouldn't be shocked if I run into him, because I show up at things, like I go to Sovereign House, and I go to readings and stuff in New York. But anyway, which is why like the face doxing thing is dumb, because like I go, I've met Dan Baltic in person, and I go and I identify myself and say who I am and what my Substack is. But anyway, Jordan Castro seems like a nice guy, and I just feel bad that I trashed this book. That said, I'm not really willing to back down. It didn't feel like you were
tearing strips off it unreasonably.
Right. That's kind of what I also ran this guy last weekend who is kind of likes Castro and was kind of not thrilled about my criticizing him, but he didn't read the whole article, and I was like, yeah, I think it's all true. I think he's given us this character who is just this kind of like shoegazing kind of wuss who is just not able to engage with other people, and but also like almost like acting like they are the problem. And it's just this adolescent, it's this kind of privileged adolescent thing that I probably engaged in myself when I was younger. But what I don't understand is presenting this as if it's like reasonable, and then all these freaking readers like connecting with it and like not, as I'm talking to people who I like, but like, I read that book and thought it was great, but I think your criticisms were also true. It's like, what the hell do you mean you thought this was great? It's like if you just read my review, I think like, you see like it's a guy describing him taking a dump for like 25% of the book, and it's just disgusting, and it's him sitting on Instagram flipping through like a bunch of people who also sound just like adult children, acting like fools, on social media. On what planet is this a good book? On what planet is this a based book? What? So anyway, it may be like the closeness of this character to me, and then the foreignness of Caudell's characters to me. That kind of tone that, as I described in Caudell's thing, of almost like bickering siblings. Like it may be me too close to the Castro character and like kind of willing to be rougher on him because of my familiarity, and then being able to treat Caudell's characters with a bit more of generosity, just because they're out-grouped to me. That's not my world, basically. So it may be that.
I wonder if it could be, if it could be, so much of the power of literature is this empathy it allows you to feel for the characters. But if you have enough personal experiences with a character similar enough to those experiences, you almost just fall into that. You fall into recognizing the character in the book as people you interact with in the world, whom you might not like, and in that case, you'll have a bunch of negative connotations with that character or associations with that character.
Yeah. Well, but so it may be that. That said, like, also to defend myself, I think that Caudell does a better job. He does like this comprehensive job of presenting these characters as like, these are simple, basically fucked up people who are like dying like flies right now, and they live in a shitty situation, and like there's a lot you can shit talk on them for, but like there's humanity here. Like, look at this little love story, look at this marriage that just falls apart because of these pills and opioid addictions and just their inability to control themselves. And you come away like, again, having read about this kind of quote unquote scatological, that word to me is just so bizarre. Like, when are we raising scatology to a kind of, almost, why does it need this kind of Latinate ology added to it? It's talking about shit. But Caudell does it a number of times. Like, this guy, there's a number of described defecations in that book, but they're kind of like, they're completely appropriate. Because the guy does nothing but eat fast food and drink milkshakes and beer and energy drinks. And suddenly he's, walking along the side of the highway, and he has to like rip his underpants off and take a dump on the side of the road and like wipe his ass and continue walking, or he has to rush into a truck stop bathroom. And it's like appropriate to the character who is base. Jordan Castro's character is like a loser who has nothing to do over the course of the day but sit there and check Twitter, and then go and like drink a pot of coffee and then describe like his pointless defecation for a quarter of the book. It's I'm going to just be perfectly frank. Again, it's not crazy to question if I'll meet and even like and become friends with Jordan Castro at some point, but I don't think he did a good job. Like, I don't. Like, there's some authors, by the way, like, in fact, I think David Foster Wallace is one. I think Zadie Smith is one, where, like, I don't think your fiction is that great, but your nonfiction, I think, is wonderful. It's not impossible that Jordan Castro is among that group, where I just don't think you've done a good job with the fiction, but, your nonfiction is great.
If we're talking artistic scatology, James Joyce was also someone who was a practitioner of that. Yeah,
but again, I think what you mean is Leopold Bloom in Ulysses. Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
The thing is, though, it's so much of Joyce, particularly for me, Ulysses. I haven't read Finnegan's Wake. Like, I couldn't do it.
Yeah, I've opened up random
I appreciate
pages.
the river run past Adam and Eve, but
yeah.
getting through hundreds of pages of that.
No, I know.
But Ulysses is, in terms of what happens in it, that's not really why you're there. You're there for the prose.
Yep, exactly.
And yeah, it's like, even like, I think, was it Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus having a piss against a fence is towards the end of the book, and it's described.
Remind me of that part again.
I think it's towards the end of the book where he's basically describing. I think it's Bloom and Dedalus, but it might be other characters because I read this a while ago. But he's describing them both taking a piss, but using highly mathematical, scientific language, describing the precise trajectories, and it's just
I know.
I'm on board for this because this is just so strange and so well executed.
I know. Yeah, he's unbelievable.
It's one of
he
those
did a great job.
Where you think, like, what on earth is going on? Like, how did you come up with this and then execute it so well?
Yeah, I know. No, he's the best. So yes, and I wish, and I'm willing to read almost anything. You can go into these disgusting things if you're doing a good job. If you're not, like, you've got to deal with me, especially if I'm irritated by other things in the book, which, again, I don't like, because there are people I've met who I'm friends with now who like the novelist. And so I don't want to go like too crazy here, but like, to me, it's impossible to read this book and not come away just like, what is wrong with this moron who wrote this book? It's like, it's that strong in me. And I like kind of like moderated and tried to like make my tone even somewhat diplomatic, but just to describe the experience of reading the book is to describe like getting a little bit like irritated. It's my novel.
So I won't pass judgment on this book because I've never read it. But do you think part of the reason why it is seeing some success is because there is a hunger for, I think you describe it as masculine fiction, if you want to describe that or define that in a bit more detail. But if there is a hunger on behalf of particularly men for literary fiction that deals with sort of men feeling sort of male emotions or experiencing some sort of male interiority.
Yeah.
And because there's not so much of that, at least being conventionally published, that people might latch onto it because it's at least going somewhat towards scratching that itch.
Yeah.
Particularly if they haven't found something like Caleb Caudell's work or ARX-Han's work, Dan Baltic's work, Matt Pagus's work, and so on.
So I'll be honest, I don't know. As I said kind of earlier in this podcast, like, what's happening in literary fiction is probably reasonable. It's probably healthy for these different groups to process what does it mean to be a woman or black or gay or whatever. And so I don't want to like, yes, I do think there is like a tribal kind of hostility that's developed, like, among the kind of literary fiction clique with, against kind of men and whites and all these things. But I don't think it's dangerous. I don't think it's totalitarian. I don't think it's the end of the world. And I think if you get a room full of these people together, they're probably not going to be thrilled about white men. But if you get them individually or even smaller groups out of that, they're probably just perfectly fine, right? And so I don't want to like attack their project really, because I also think it actually helps us to a certain extent, because all of the kind of just like passive, like low effort readers of fiction are in their camp. And to some extent, like, I don't care about writing to those people. I don't care about having kind of fair weather fans like among our crowd. So, but what it does mean is, yes, probably this phenomenon of like masculine things, themes within fiction are not really happening in the mainstream because the mainstream is, processing this, these other kind of issues. but there are some people that want to read books for and about men that are not, that are willing to be a bit edgy and a bit like challenging of some of the kind of smug ideas of this group in the mainstream of literary fiction. I don't. If it is true that Jordan Castro is speaking to these people, then I am in the wrong group, right? What Jordan Castro has described to me is is almost a person with, like, as I mentioned, like almost like a social disability. And I think there are a lot of people out there like that in our sphere. But I don't think the values of the novel are speaking to like our sphere in any other way than just that they're some man and this guy's a man. I don't know how to define masculine fiction other than just like people who for one reason or another feel alienated from the more feminized consensus within literary fiction. I don't know. And then to summarize, I'm not super like threatened by or mad at what's going on in literary fiction too.
Yeah, particularly because self-publishing exists.
Yeah, exactly. We've got an outlet.
Yeah, and it's just not that adversarial. Or I maybe I'm being naive, but I don't view it as that adversarial either. I mean, they're just different markets, and people are able to write books into different markets, and it just doesn't really bother me that much. One funny thing from it, though, that I have heard is this might be an isolated Substack phenomenon, but there does seem to be hand-wringing about how men aren't reading. And this could well be just the people I know, given I voluntarily podcast to talk about books, but it does strike me that there are plenty of men reading. It's more men aren't really reading contemporary fiction, but I know a lot of men who read fairly concrete works on, say, self-improvement or learning a particular skill, like how to do SEO. A lot of people reading the classics, and a handful of philosophers, especially Nietzsche.
Yep. I actually don't. I'm going to be honest. I don't know a lot of men that read. Like,
really? Okay. It might just be me.
Or there are people who read like articles but not books. It's like, okay, but no, I don't know a lot of guys that are like cranking through books in the same way, say, I am, where I'm finishing 30 or 40 in a year or something. And it's in fact I have almost no one to talk about literature with.
Do you have a feel for why that might be? Is it just everyone's attention span is fried to a greater or lesser extent by something as distracting as the internet?
I think there's just like competitors that are just first of all, not every. So what I like about fiction, maybe what you like about fiction and long form prose, let's say, is it's able to achieve depth and kind of in that way that you were saying with Piper at the Gates of Dawn, where there's this lead up to the reveal of the spiritual component. All of that lead up takes time. In my view, there's a payoff, but people are. I don't think it's that their attention spans have been harmed. It's just that there's a demand for things to get to the point faster. Get there faster. In my view, certain messages require more pretext, and more context, really. And so prose works perfectly, and I'm just satisfied. But there's a lot of guys who'd rather just read bullet points or 144 characters or whatever Twitter is now, and they're roughly fine. And you just have a lot of demands on your time, and if you're not specifically someone who loves fiction, like why? You can watch a movie, you can watch YouTube, you can listen to music. There's other stuff. Video games, I think, is the big one. And when people say that, like, you hear this kind of line that, like, TikTok is a harm people's attention span. It's like, well, some of these kids can sit there and focus on video games for like 3-4 hours straight. If you get their attention, it's anyone's attention. They can watch football for a long time, whatever. So I just think there's a lot of competition.
It's a shockingly level-headed take.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
very sensible.
Do you disagree?
No, not really.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is actually just competition. Also because when you consider when reading was becoming more widespread, you actually did have hand-wringing over people spending all of their time
I'm sure
reading books and not doing something more valuable. Probably because at that time, in terms of high stimulus escapism, that was probably the highest stimulus escapism you could get. Whereas now, like, you can just play video games, which are, even just from a very crude sensory perspective, they're loud noises and flashing colourful lights. That all the things that the human sensory apparatus likes and pays attention to.
I'm 39 years old. I used to play Halo 2, I guess, in probably 2006 or 7. I never really had, like, that's probably the last time I played video games. But I remember going to my friend, my friend actually who died. I would go to his house, and he had this big, he had these roommates and people he lived with, and we would all play. We'd probably start at 10 o'clock at night, and I would be like, all right, I'm playing, a little bit of Halo here or whatever. And I'm not a gamer at all. And I'd be like, all right, I'll be here 2 hours. That's it. I'd look up, it'd be 4 a.m, and it was just exciting. And we were drinking and like all these people, and it was this transportable skill where I'd go. I remember I have a cousin who lives in Colorado, and I would visit him, and suddenly, you're playing Halo with him and all his friends. And it was just awesome, and it was like, again, I'm not a gamer. I'm not really drawn to it. But even I was like, whoa, I probably spent hundreds of hours playing that game. And easily, the hours just disappear, Oh,
100%. And especially as certain developers research ways to hold attention. So the optimal amount of time between performing an action and getting a reward. Some of them are becoming virtual Skinner boxes.
I bet.
Yeah.
And like, it's not crazy, And so anyway, again, as with a lot of these things, like I've said earlier, like I don't think this is the end of the world. Like, I don't think, I think I think it's I think it's cool. I think it's reasonable. I think we should, embrace these things.
Yeah, it's I mean, they don't have the depth in things that I really, really care about that I find in fiction. Yeah. But that also could just be a personal preference. Like, I'm coming to fiction for that sense of transportation to another person's subjectivity. And that, like, not everyone is doing that.
Yeah.
If that's not something that I think Halo 2 is advertising itself as providing.
No, not at all.
It's like, no, you can play Halo 2 because you want to shoot aliens.
And there also might be like an age element where, like, ages whatever, like 11 to 23 or whatever, like that Halo experience is useful for socializing and whatever. And but as you get older, you're in your 50s and 60s or something, and there's more of the fiction period. I don't know, because I knew older guys do. Oh yeah, what's up?
No, go on.
I think there are, like, actually, I remember there was a period where I didn't read that much. I was an English major in undergrad, but, my early 20s, I was like, I don't know, I was just like more social. I spent all my time, I was trying to write fiction, but I wasn't reading as much fiction anymore. And I used to play squash, actually. And I was at this squash court, and this guy who was like in his 60s was like, oh my God, my daughter just told me about this book. Or no, I started reading this book that my daughter sent me. And it is just blowing my mind right now. And I was like, oh, I'm interested in a recommendation. He said, oh, it's called Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. I've just never read anything like it. And I was like, all right, and I actually did go out and buy it. And I don't know, again, I was probably 23, 24. And I sat down, I was like, whoa, this is awesome. And so Cormac McCarthy, who I like talk all this trash on, was actually the person who kind of brought me back into reading fiction through a recommendation. And then this other guy, I got another recommendation for Lolita by Nabokov. And then
Mm-hmm.
And before that, I was more of like a fiction reader in school, and I was, I liked it and did well and everything. And but I didn't. There was nothing like super relevant to me until I read in college, like outside of school, just for fun, Confederacy of Dunces. And I remember, and I've actually gone back to that book.
That's fantastic, that book.
Well, I actually went back to it a couple of years ago and didn't really like, even though it's right up my lane, but I didn't like it as much. But when I was like 19 or 20, I read that book and was laughing out loud. And I guess now I'm thinking about it, there was another book I read, some William S. Burroughs when I was even younger than that, and that was another. It's like, whoa, this is it almost feels like having a CD that your parents don't want you to have, like having a book.
Yeah.
And there's something cool about that. So yeah, I guess like as a young man, like I kind of need these like edgy things. And now as I'm older, I don't need that or want that really as much at all.
Maybe I shouldn't return to A Confederacy of Dunces then, because I read it probably when I was 19 or 20 and thought it was just absolutely hilarious.
Oh, me too. It was like probably my favorite book.
Maybe I'll keep those good memories. I won't post that there.
Well, maybe you'll like it. I don't know. I forget what I didn't like about it. I think I started listening to it again in like 2000. So for me, I probably read it in like 2006. And that's when I was like, wow, I love this. And then I came back to it probably in 2017 or 18, 16 or 17, I think, actually. And I don't know, I was less impressed that time.
Have you read Nutcrankr by Dan Baltic? Because I'm
in the middle of it.
He's very open about how influenced he was.
Dude, I'm finding it to be
I found
like
that very funny.
Yeah. Right now I'm at the part where they're at the March for Our Lives, the march in Washington D.C., where he's finding out that his girlfriend is in like a relationship with the guy who drove him down there. I'm loving Nutcrankr. I'm really loving it. Yeah, I know it is excruciating. I actually like. I'll be honest with you. I think Nutcrankr is better than Confederacy of Dunces. I love it.
Tell Dan Baltic that he'll love it.
I know. I do. I actually like kind of.
He'll be stoked.
He lives in New York, and I don't live far from there, and I've seen him in person. I met him in person, so I probably will tell him that next time I see him.
So, coming up on 3 hours, but at the beginning of this, I said, it'll probably be an hour and a half, but I've been enjoying myself. But before we wrap up, are there any authors that you particularly highly recommend, particularly those who are, say, independent or self-published authors, that you think just aren't getting the attention they deserve?
Besides, I think that Baltic, again, these ones that you already know, so your audience, it's not going to be a big surprise. So the Baltic book I'm loving, it's a different thing though. It's kind of this low definition in prose. It's no offense to Dan, but it's not the deepest book, but it's hilarious and it's relevant. And, it's not something I normally would be drawn to, except it's just so well done. And it's so in my lane that it's like an immediate classic for me. So that one,
natured.
What, the book?
Yeah. It's actually, I found it was a very good-natured book. It didn't feel mean-spirited at all, which was,
I agree.
It's really refreshing.
So I don't know, the books, I just review, I would say, all right. So, I think Han's book is, for me, it's, getting close to the top of the pile. Because it's just, that high definition thing is good, even though ideologically, he does have this materialist conception of the universe. And I do think, that he's not, like when he was on, I don't know what podcast he was on most recently. I don't know if it was yours or, Tukey's, but, I do think he's not, I don't think he fully understands the kind of Christian conception of things, but, even still, I just think he's doing a great job, and I love that book. And then, Caudell. So I finished his, the Neighbour. I have an autographed copy because I met him in person. I have an autographed copy of his most recent, like, autofiction, which we'll see what that's like. But good. Is it really? You liked it?
Yeah, I liked it.
Yeah, but anyway, so honestly, I don't really, outside of our little sphere, this is where all my reading is, and then my, and then I basically review the books as soon as I'm done with them. It takes me usually a couple weeks to write the review, but because I just don't have any time, I could probably do them in a day or two if I had time. But and let me think here. There was this guy. Oh yeah, I like this book called Lost Causes by Richard Nichols, who I haven't seen. Like, he was kind of used to be active on Twitter, and he spent a long time writing this book called Lost Causes, which is like a James Bond-ish book, and it's just this kind of politically incorrect and somewhat reactionary. And I think he told me that it had, like, a big publisher had bought it and then like basically dropped it because of subject matter. It's got some minor problems, but if you like that kind of like action, more like Hollywood action style book, but with our, I don't want to say our, but with kind of like more masculine, it's a bit more like, I don't share its politics entirely, but it does have that kind of kick-ass like James Bond vibe, but in a contemporary context. Lost Cause by Richard Nichols is pretty good, worth reading. And I think he lives in Mexico or something, but he has a podcast, I think. Yeah, he would be the only one that I haven't seen like our guys talk about so much, and it's maybe worth checking out.
Yeah, so thanks very, very much for coming on. Is there any other projects of yours that you want people to be aware of? In addition to post-liberal book reviews on Substack?
No, I've been writing a work of fiction that's like, it's basically like my entire life revolves around it. And I've been writing it for about 9 years. And I don't know, I would imagine it'll probably take another 2 years to finish. But eventually I'll put that out. But that's kind of like, I've quit jobs to work on that book. So I poured so much time into it. That's basically
when you're done, like, please do it. If you want, send it and I'll read it and come on again.
Like
about it.
Anything I know about fiction, I've learned in the process of writing that book. That's that's reality. But so we'll see. We'll see how it goes. It does have very it's kind of unique style, so I think it'll polarize people. But again, I'm just releasing it into our little world. So I think it'll be all right.
I really look forward to that.
Thanks.
So thanks very much for coming on. I really encourage people, particularly if you've listened this far, to check out Postliberal Book Reviews. Really, really interesting reviews, really, really interesting approach to novels in particular. But thanks again for coming on. And for listeners, see you next time.